Hello, fellow Sapiens. Sit back, relax, and prepare to meet your ancestors. Whether you're drifting to sleep, driving through the night, or just trying to quiet your thoughts, welcome to Sleepless Homo, where history is told softly. This is slow science and deep time storytelling. Humble researchers, ancient bones, and quiet curiosity. Tonight's episode is a special one. A frequent listener request inspired by a thoughtful comment from our community. It's an honour to bring the story to life, exploring how archaeology has learned to see its own reflection, and correct the biases buried beneath the dust. If you enjoy calm, factual journeys through the deep past, consider liking and subscribing. It helps other sleepless minds find this quiet corner of curiosity, and if you happen to drift off mid-story, the timestamps below will guide you back when you wake. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. Imagine this. A man in a wool coat kneels in a foreign desert, holding a trowel like a relic of empire. The air smells of dust and ink. Behind him, assistants in pressed uniforms take notes while local labourers dig in silence. It is the mid-19th century and the modern science of archaeology is being born. But what he is really uncovering, though he doesn't know it, is himself. The bones and pottery he draws into his notebook are reflections of the world he lives in. A world of hierarchy, race, and empire. When the first archaeologists brushed soil from a skull, they believed they were revealing truth. In reality, they were also layering it with their own stories. Every trench was a mirror. Every hypothesis was a confession. The 19th century loved classification. Everything in its place, labelled, measured, and ranked. Geologists were mapping strata, naturalists were ordering species, and the same impulse crept into archaeology, to fit the past into neat, familiar boxes. Civilizations were arranged like social classes, from primitive to advanced, a ladder of time modelled suspiciously on Victorian society itself. At the top of that ladder naturally stood Europe. The discoveries pouring in from Egypt, Mesopotamia and Greece were not seen as parts of shared human memory, but as trophies of a lineage that supposedly led to us. Every museum became a monument to that idea. The British Museum, the Louvre, and Berlin's Neues Museum filled with marble faces and golden masks that seemed to confirm a comforting narrative. Civilization was born elsewhere, but matured in the West. That assumption was not a finding of science, and it was a product of empire. Beneath the trenches lay not only ruins, but also the foundations of bias. The Victorians believed deeply in progress, that time itself was a straight road from barbarism to enlightenment. Archaeology offered the perfect stage for that belief. Ancient sites became moral lessons. Look how far we've come. When they unearthed tools or bones, they read them as chapters in a story that led directly to themselves, to their institutions, their order, their authority. What they did not see, or could not yet imagine, was that the earth tells stories in spirals, not ladders. Progress is not a march. It is a loop of survival, collapse and rediscovery. But in that century, certainty was power. Excavations in Egypt, Assyria and Troy became imperial theatre. Men like Heinrich Schliemann, Giovanni Belzoni and Austin Henry Layard were celebrated not just as scientists but as conquerors of time. They worked with the confidence of empire, digging through foreign soils, taking what they found and bringing it home to display beneath columns of marble. Their journals spoke of discoveries, not recoveries, as though the artifacts had been waiting centuries just to be claimed. Local knowledge was often dismissed or silenced. The hands that did the digging rarely made it into the history books. The same social order that governed Victorian life governed the excavation trench. Those who held the spades were nameless. Those who held the pens wrote history. Archaeology became an extension of empire, both in method and in meaning. To dig the past was to assert control over it, to translate another culture's ruins into one's own language, one's own narrative of human destiny. It is easy to forget that even the concept of prehistory, so a time before writing, is a 19th century invention. Before then, the ancient world was known through myth and scripture. But as geology pushed the Earth's age into millions of years, archaeology had to invent a new kind of story, one without gods or witnesses. This was thrilling, but also terrifying. If time was vast, where did humanity fit within it? The Victorians filled that silence with themselves. The first human fossils were not read as part of a diverse evolutionary tree, but as rungs on a ladder. Primitive skeletons were often interpreted as proof of the early and inferior, reinforcing racial hierarchies that justified colonization. The skull, measured and catalogued, became a political instrument. Science blurred into ideology. For a generation that saw itself as the pinnacle of progress, it was comforting to imagine that others, living or ancient, represented earlier stages. In truth, those stages existed only in imagination. The soil held no such categories, it only held lives. And yet, amid these biases, something remarkable was happening. Archaeology was teaching humans to think in scales larger than history, to see themselves as temporary inhabitants of deep time. The trowel, for all its misuse, became a bridge between centuries. The first stratigraphic drawings, the first carbon-black sketches of pottery shards, were the beginning of a new humility, even if the scientists themselves didn't yet feel it. They believed they were mastering time. In reality, time was beginning to humble them. Many early excavators never questioned why they dug or whom they were representing. Their funding came from kings, universities, and colonial offices. Their reports were written in the language of certainty. But slowly cracks began to show in the mirror. When local scholars and indigenous voices began to speak back, when women started entering universities and curating collections, the story started to shift. The ground began, quite literally, to move beneath archaeology's feet. But in those first decades, bias was still sediment, unseen, compacted, part of the foundation. Victorian science was not evil. It was simply human, curious, ambitious, and deeply shaped by its own time. Every generation mistakes its worldview for objectivity. We do it still. What is most haunting about those early excavations is not the arrogance, but the sincerity. These were people who truly believed they were revealing truth. They were not villains, but mirrors. They carried lanterns into the dark, never realizing how much of their own shadow fell across the stones. The hierarchies they saw in society, class, race, gender, they unknowingly carved into the past. And those carvings lasted. For over a century, textbooks and museums would echo their assumptions, that men hunted, women gathered, that civilization moved from east to west, that complexity meant superiority. It would take generations to begin unlearning those ideas, and even now, the unlearning continues. But here, in the mid-19th century, it all began, with shovels, with sketchbooks, and with certainty disguised as discovery. Imagine being there, the click of the trowel, the faint outline of a pot emerging from soil untouched for millennia. The archaeologist kneels closer, brushes the dust away, and for a moment feels he's holding the world's memory in his hands. He doesn't see that his reflection is already there, in the way he describes, classifies, and names it. The science that would one day tell us who we are began by telling us who we thought we were, and in that difference between excavation and reflection, archaeology found its most human truth, that knowledge, like the earth itself, is layered. Each discovery carries the fingerprints of the time that found it. And so, perhaps the truest excavation is not into the ground, but into our own assumptions. The mirror in the dust was always there. We are still learning how to see it. Imagine standing in a lecture hall more than a century ago, when the idea of prehistory was still young enough to feel like mythology. The air smells faintly of coal smoke and varnish, the light golden and uneven. On a wooden table sits a skull, a few stone flakes, and a long iron pointer. A man in a waistcoat clears his throat and begins to describe what he believes is the first human story. He calls it Man the Hunter. It is the story of a clever animal who rose to dominance through strength, tool-making, and aggression. And for almost 100 years, this image would shape how we saw ourselves. What made that story so convincing was not malice or arrogance, but timing. The mid-19th century was an age obsessed with industry, hierarchy and competition. Darwin's Origin of Species, published in the year 1859, offered a natural law that seemed to fit the machinery of the modern world: struggle, adaptation, survival. Thinkers like Thomas Huxley and Herbert Spencer merged those ideas with social theory, sketching an evolutionary ladder that conveniently resembled the factories and empires of their day, each part working toward progress, each layer superior to the one below. It was an elegant way to make sense of both biology and the world they had built. And so, when the first human bones and tools began to surface in Europe, those discoveries were filtered through a system of thought already tuned to see competition as destiny. A sharpened flint became not just a tool, but proof of conquest. A mammoth bone spearhead meant dominance. An upright posture suggested mastery over nature. The earliest reconstructions of cave dwellers, painted by scientists like Gabriel de Mortier or Charles R. Knight, showed muscular figures, often male, crouched beside prey or brandishing weapons against rival tribes. The mind of early humanity was imagined as a battlefield of survival instincts, driven by the same forces that built railways and armies. What archaeology found in the ground, philosophy quietly dressed in the logic of its own time. It was a story that made sense because it mirrored its authors. In an age of steam and steel, the past too was imagined as an engine. The spear became a symbol not only of defence but of innovation, a technological leap, a spark of intention that separated us from beasts. Scientists began to link tool use with intelligence, brain size and moral advancement. To make tools, they argued, was to think abstractly. To hunt was to plan. It seemed a tidy formula for the rise of humanity. What this framework overlooked, however, was not political but methodological. It treated one behaviour, aggression, as a universal key. Many early excavations focused on weapon-shaped tools and hunting sites, because those were easier to identify and classify than, say, gathering or shelter building. Bones of large game preserved better than wooden digging sticks or woven nets. The physical record appeared to confirm the theory, but only because the theory guided where people looked. Even Darwin, cautious as he was, warned that selection favoured many traits beyond strength: cooperation, empathy, curiosity. Yet those subtler forces left fewer marks in stone. The hunter narrative grew partly from the nature of evidence itself. The sharp things survived. By the early 20th century, this view had hardened into academic doctrine. Anthropology textbooks described humanity's ascent as a straight path from tool-making apes to territorial tribes to civilizations. Primitive art was interpreted as hunting magic, and division of labour was assumed rather than observed. Museums filled with dioramas showing hairy men chasing mammoths, while women and children waited by fires, not because fossils said so, but because it felt logical within the values of the time. The scientific error here was not the presence of bias, but the absence of testing. The first generation of anthropologists lacked the cross-disciplinary methods we now take for granted: isotope analysis, sediment dating, taphonomy, experimental replication. Their conclusions rested on comparative anatomy and intuition. A flint blade meant a warrior, a bone pendant meant decoration. Archaeology, still young, was learning the language of evidence by trial and error. What followed was an important correction. As the 20th century matured, so did field methods. Stratigraphy, carbon dating and microscopic wear analysis revealed a richer picture of early human behaviour, one that included communal food sharing, tool reuse, and long-term planning. Sites once labelled hunting camps turned out to be base settlements or butchering stations shared by groups of varying ages. The image of constant warfare gave way to something more ecological, more adaptive. Humanity's early intelligence appeared to rest not only on conflict, but on flexibility and cooperation, traits that modern ethology now recognises in many social mammals. But even as evidence corrected the narrative, the power of the myth endured. Man the Hunter had already embedded itself in popular imagination. It appeared in films, adventure novels and museum murals well into the 1960s. And in a way, that persistence tells its own truth. We're a species that understands the unknown through stories first and data later. The early archaeologists were not villains. They were mirrors. They projected what they knew of the world, labour, invention, danger, onto the shadows of deep time. The important thing is that science learned to recognise its reflection and adjust the lens. The modern correction did not erase the hunter. It simply placed him back among everything else we were. As archaeology refined its methods, the picture of our ancestors grew less dramatic but more profound. The spear became just one expression of survival among many. Alongside digging sticks, pigments, fire hearths, and footprints of children playing in ancient mud, each told a quieter, more complex story of adaptation. The great myth of the 19th century was not that humans were hunters, but that they were only hunters. The correction that followed reminds us why science must never stop questioning its own assumptions. It was not ideology that changed the picture, but evidence. Carbon dating, microscopic residue, trace elements of shared meals in communal hearths. Each fragment whispered something subtler than conquest. Cooperation, endurance, and imagination. Perhaps that is the real evolution, not in the fossils themselves, but in how we learn to see them. The story of man the hunter is less about error than about the slow, humbling growth of a discipline. Archaeology, like the species it studies, adapts. Every new discovery forces it to revise the story it once told with such certainty, and in that way, each overturned assumption becomes a sign of progress, proof that even the past can evolve in our understanding. Imagine this. A dusty museum storeroom in the 1920s, rows of wooden drawers labelled in careful ink, male warrior, female offering, juvenile specimen. Inside, fragments of bone lie cushioned in faded cotton. Every specimen has a story, not just of who it once was, but of who decided what it was supposed to be. Early osteology, the study of bones, was still more art than science. Its practitioners relied on eyes trained by habit and expectation. The rule was simple: broad pelvis, female; thick brow ridge, male; strong muscle attachments, male again. But nature, as always, had a way of breaking rules. The archaeologists of the early 20th century inherited not just the bones of the past, but the frameworks of the 19th. They worked without DNA, isotopes, or scanning technology. Instead, they used calipers, intuition, and context. A skeleton found with weapons was called a man. One found with beads or pottery was assumed to be a woman. In their notebooks, those labels became permanent, he and she written with the same confidence as skull or femur. What those annotations really measured, though, was not just bone, but belief. The early field seasons of the 1920s and 30s were filled with quiet certainty. Archaeology was becoming institutional. University departments, museums, and colonial expeditions all racing to classify humanity. The ambition was noble, to create order out of the Earth's confusion. Yet the tools of interpretation were limited. Bone density, pelvic width, and cranial mass were treated as direct proxies for biological sex, even when weathering disease or age could distort them. Reports from sites in Europe, North Africa, and the Near East show how easily this practice became reflex. A skeleton discovered with hunting tools was recorded as male adult, approximately 30 years old. The notes rarely mentioned that the bones themselves were fragmentary, or that the classification depended entirely on association. The record hardened before the evidence did. The mid-century osteologists were not careless. They were working within the best framework available to them. Anatomical textbooks of the time still described male skeletons as larger, heavier, more angular, and female skeletons as lighter, smoother, more gracile. Those general patterns exist in averages, but individuals often defy averages. Pathology, nutrition and lifestyle can alter bone structure beyond simple categories. A life of carrying loads, grinding grain, or walking long distances can thicken limb bones regardless of sex. The bones remembered activity more vividly than identity. And yet, when an archaeologist opened a burial, the habit of binary assignment was nearly automatic. Field logs from this era read like inventories of certainty. The archaeologist might note soil depth, artifact type, and posture, then finish with a confident sex, male. Sometimes that decision came before the skeleton was even fully exposed. The reasoning often went unrecorded, as if the conclusion were self-evident. A spear was enough to make a warrior, a spindle whorl was enough to make a woman. The irony is that the people themselves, those buried thousands of years before, may not have seen their world divided so neatly. But early 20th century science had not yet learned to separate the biological from the cultural. Forensic anthropology was just emerging, borrowing techniques from anatomy and criminology. Measurements like skull breadth, femur length, and pelvis angle became statistical norms, but without global reference samples, those norms reflected regional biases, mostly European populations, mostly male skeletal collections from hospitals and wars. When archaeologists applied them elsewhere, the results carried invisible assumptions about size, strength, and sex. One can almost imagine the moment. A scientist leaning over a field table comparing a femur to a printed chart, nodding quietly as the measurement confirms what the artifacts had already suggested. The process looked empirical, but the pattern guided the data. These early decades of osteology were as much about classification as curiosity. Every labelled bone added a brushstroke to humanity's self-portrait, and like any portrait, it reflected the artist's eye. The archives from this period, handwritten logs, specimen cards, correspondence, are filled with polite confidence. A skull from a cave in France might be tagged female, ceremonial burial, simply because of its proximity to shell beads. Another from a step grave might be labelled male warrior because of a blade. Rarely do we see notes that admit uncertainty, though we now know such uncertainty is the rule, not the exception. Over time, these small assumptions compounded. Textbooks cited site reports. Museums built displays from textbook illustrations. Visitors saw patterns that seemed undeniable, men with weapons, women with pottery. The feedback loop was complete. The story stabilized not because it was proven, but because it was repeated. The mid-20th century would begin to challenge that stability, but during these formative years, the archaeological imagination was still learning to distinguish data from interpretation. The labelling of bones by pronoun was not only linguistic but conceptual, an attempt to translate ancient lives into familiar categories. It gave researchers a way to speak about individuals across millennia, to humanize them, but in doing so, it sometimes replaced the unknown with the comfortable. To be fair, the field had its skeptics even then. A few osteologists quietly pointed out that bone morphology overlaps widely between sexes, and that cultural associations were shaping conclusions more than measurements. Papers from the 1940s began to call for larger comparative data sets, for double-blind analyses, for caution in using context as confirmation. But those voices were drowned in the confidence of an era that prized system over ambiguity. It took the slow accumulation of contradictory findings, skeletons that did not match their grave goods, individuals whose robust bones defied classification, to reveal the cracks in the method. The story of early osteology is, in that sense, another lesson in scientific humility. Each generation inherits not only the tools of its predecessors, but their habits of thought. The bones did not change, our questions did. The labels in those drawers, written in neat fountain pen ink, remind us that science is always a translation, from matter into meaning, from silence into story. And like any translation, it reflects the language of its time. To open one of those old specimen drawers today is to read both the skeleton and the sentence imposed upon it. The challenge for modern archaeology is not to erase those early efforts, but to learn from them, to treat even their mistakes as data about how knowledge evolves. Science, after all, is not a monument to certainty, but a record of correction. What we can admire in those early osteologists is their discipline, their devotion to evidence, their belief that bone could tell the truth. And in a way, it did, just not the whole truth. It told the story of its discoverers as much as of its dead. Each measurement, each label, each pronoun was an attempt to listen. And if the message came back distorted, that distortion still carries information, the echo of a science learning to hear. It's the middle of the 20th century, and the world has just survived its most violent century of invention. Cities rebuilt, factories restarted, and in classrooms across Europe and America, the story of human origins began to mirror the mood of recovery. In the glow of new prosperity, the scientific imagination turned domestic. The cave became a home, the hunter became a father, and the gatherer became a mother. Textbooks written between the 1940s and 1960s are full of this imagery. The tidy reconstruction of prehistory as a reflection of post-war normality. A spear replaced the briefcase, a fire replaced the television, and around that fire sat a nuclear family projected backward into the Ice Age. It was a comforting image. It made the unknown past feel familiar, almost suburban. But it was also an example of how science, even while striving for objectivity, can't help but borrow metaphors from the world that funds and teaches it. Anthropology during this period was professionalising rapidly. Universities were producing new departments, and the field wanted a unifying theory of human behaviour. Evolutionary biology, psychology and economics were converging on a shared model. Competition, specialisation and cooperation within small social units. This model made sense for explaining both business and biology. And so, when researchers described hunter-gatherer societies, they naturally adopted the same framework: division of labour, efficiency, production. The prehistoric campfire became an early economy. Men were cast as the producers of food through hunting, while women became managers of consumption, responsible for hearth, child-rearing, and domestic stability. It was an elegant metaphor for the industrial world disguised as prehistory. Illustrations from this era show it clearly. Cave scenes painted for museums or printed in schoolbooks often depict a strong man in mid-throw, spear in hand, framed by light entering the cave mouth. Behind him, a woman kneels by the fire preparing food or holding an infant. Children watch admiringly. Even when artists intended these as neutral depictions, the composition spoke a cultural language: hero and hearth. Outside was danger and discovery. Inside was comfort and continuity. Archaeological finds were often interpreted through this lens without much questioning. A concentration of bones and tools in one area was called a hunting camp. A cluster of grinding stones near a hearth was labelled a domestic zone. The symmetry of these spaces reinforced the imagined balance between the sexes and, by extension, the social ideals of the modern age. The pattern was so effective because it seemed logical. Every society needs both providers and caregivers. But what turned this assumption into dogma was repetition. The phrase, man the hunter, woman the gatherer, began appearing in academic writing in the 1950s, not as poetry, but as shorthand, a neat, memorable formula for the evolutionary partnership that supposedly defined humanity. It explained everything from cooperation to brain size. Hunting demanded communication, planning and teamwork, so it was credited with driving intelligence. Gathering was described as repetitive but nurturing, anchoring the social fabric. It was a tidy binary that fit perfectly within the optimism of the post-war world, where roles were clear, progress was linear, and every contribution had its place. In truth, the mid-century archaeologists were building models, not myths. They were trying to explain how humans survived for so long in so many environments, and models by nature simplify. But simplification has a way of hardening into belief. Once the hunter model entered popular science writing, it spread quickly through documentaries, magazines, and education. It became part of how the public imagined the past. The caveman with a club became a cultural mascot, not because evidence demanded it, but because it fit into a larger story about industriousness and order. The image reassured people that survival had always depended on the same values that defined modern life: work, family, stability. Behind this narrative was a broader sociological context. After the chaos of war, societies longed for stability. In that light, even science reflected the collective wish to return to something predictable. The prehistoric family offered an origin myth for domestic peace, proof that order was ancient and natural. Anthropologists writing in the 1950s used language that echoed the tone of social manuals rather than field reports. Terms like male provisioning and female nurturance became standard descriptors. Excavation notes from that time show how expectations shaped classification. Stone flakes were called hunting tools. Bone awls were called household implements. The labels came first, the evidence followed. What makes this period fascinating is not the errors themselves, but the consistency with which they appeared. Across continents and cultures, excavation reports from France to Kenya to North America use the same vocabulary, as though the entire species had been standardized. The scientific community was small, journals circulated widely, and the few leading voices defined the tone for decades. Their influence was amplified by the growing power of visual media. Museum dioramas, film reels, and illustrated encyclopedias repeated the imagery until it became self-evident. Children in schoolrooms grew up believing the Ice Age family looked just like their own, only colder and hairier. There is a certain poetry in that, and perhaps even a necessary one. Science, like art, sometimes uses metaphor to make complexity comprehensible. The mid-century scientists were not driven by ideology so much as by the need for coherence. They were working with limited data and vast timeframes, and storytelling became a bridge between evidence and understanding. The idea of the stable prehistoric household helped unify anthropology, psychology, and sociology under a single evolutionary theme: cooperation through specialization. It was a theory of balance, half analytical, half aspirational, and yet, beneath the neat symmetry, cracks were already forming. Fieldwork in the 1940s and 50s was beginning to produce evidence that didn't quite fit the model. Mixed activity sites, shared tool use, flexible roles. But the framework was strong enough to absorb these anomalies. They were reclassified as exceptions, outliers, or transitional phases. After all, the beauty of a theory lies in its ability to explain, and the mid-century mind valued explanation over ambiguity. The public wanted a past they could recognise, not one that questioned their reflection. To understand how powerfully this narrative took hold, one only needs to read the introductions of the great anthropological texts of that period. They describe early humanity as a species that achieved survival through cooperation between the sexes, a perfectly reasonable claim. But the supporting details always aligned with modern order: men as active producers, women as passive organisers. The more carefully one reads those lines, the more one can sense the background noise of contemporary life, the hum of factories, the structure of offices, the rhythm of paychecks and family dinners. The Ice Age became an allegory for the middle class. The value of revisiting this chapter of archaeology lies not in criticism but in recognition. It shows how easily human imagination turns data into narrative and narrative into truth. The hunter and gatherer model dominated mid-20th century thought not because it was foolish, but because it worked. It was testable, elegant, and comforting. Its simplicity allowed researchers to build hypotheses, to ask new questions, and eventually to see where the model failed. Science grows through such cycles of creation and correction. By the end of the 1950s, archaeology had begun to outgrow its domestic metaphors. Field methods were improving, new regions were being excavated, and comparative ethnography was introducing variation back into the record. The world was expanding again, and with it the past. But before those changes came, the hero and hearth model had already done its work. It gave a generation of scientists a foundation to build upon, and later to dismantle. If one lesson endures from this era, it is that science, like any form of memory, reflects the shape of its time. The bones remain silent, but the questions we ask them are not. Every generation listens for its own echo in the cave. The mid-20th century found comfort in family, purpose in labour, and meaning in order. And so, it built its prehistory accordingly, a mirror of its own survival. The beauty of science is that the mirror never stays still for long. A dim lecture hall in the late 1960s, the air thick with the scent of chalk dust and optimism. On the projector screen glows a photograph of a small clay figurine, rounded, faceless, unmistakably human. The speaker, a Lithuanian-born archaeologist named Marija Gimbutas, gestures toward it with calm authority. "This," she says softly, "is not just art. It is memory." The audience leans forward. The figurine, unearthed from a Neolithic site in southeastern Europe, represents what she calls the Great Mother, a symbol of life, fertility and continuity in the societies that built the first villages. To Gimbutas and her growing circle of followers, these were not the warlike patriarchies imagined by earlier scholars. They were peaceful, agrarian cultures where reverence for life replaced the cult of conquest. The idea spread like wildfire, not only through academia but through the broader culture of the 1960s and 70s, an age hungry for renewal. For decades, prehistory had been narrated in masculine terms: spears, hunts, and hierarchies. Gimbutas' proposal reversed the polarity. Her vision was of Neolithic Europe as a matristic civilization, not ruled by women necessarily, but centered on feminine symbolism. Villages like those at Çatalhöyük, Sesklo and Knossos were reinterpreted as expressions of harmony with nature, rather than dominance over it. Where earlier archaeologists saw utilitarian vessels, she saw sacred icons. Where they found burials, she saw ritual continuity. Her maps traced a continent unified by spirals, serpents, and fertility motifs. To the public, it was a revelation, a counter-myth to centuries of stone and spear. The academic reaction was mixed. Some welcomed the broadened perspective, while others bristled at the leap from evidence to ideology. What made Gimbutas' theory so compelling was not its precision, but its poetry. The figurines she presented, small, abstract, often interpreted as female, did exist in astonishing numbers. Thousands of them had been unearthed from Neolithic sites across the Balkans and the Aegean. They varied in style but shared recurring shapes: curved bodies, triangular faces, hands folded beneath the chest. Many bore incised symbols that defied translation. Earlier archaeologists had catalogued them as idols or toys, but Gimbutas saw a coherent belief system, a long-vanished world that worshipped creation rather than destruction. Her books, The Goddesses and Gods of Old Europe in the Language of the Goddess, arrived in a moment when the public was ready to listen. Western society in the 1960s was questioning authority in every form: political, academic and cultural. The archaeological goddess found herself at the centre of that search for origins. Museums hosted exhibitions of prehistoric figurines as spiritual ancestors of a lost harmony. Popular magazines described Gimbutas as the discoverer of Europe's forgotten Eden. And for a while, the story of human prehistory tilted from the hunter's spear toward the potter's hands. In fairness, there was logic in her approach. The Neolithic transition had indeed brought profound social and environmental changes: the domestication of plants, the construction of permanent homes, and a more stable rhythm of life. Figurines, altars, and symbolic architecture did point to new kinds of social expression. But Gimbutas interpreted them through the lens of cultural longing. After 2 world wars, the idea of a peaceful cooperative civilization buried beneath the ruins of patriarchy was deeply appealing. It offered redemption not just for archaeology, but for the human story itself. Critics, however, noted that the archaeological record rarely speaks in absolutes. The same sites that produced mother goddess figurines also contained evidence of conflict, hierarchy, and trade. Symbols once seen as fertility icons sometimes turned out to be stylized animals or geometric designs. Pottery patterns varied too widely to imply a single, unified faith. Yet even as debate intensified, the myth of the great goddess became part of popular culture. She appeared in art, music, and literature. Less as a historical figure than as an archetype, the pendulum had swung. In a sense, this moment revealed a truth about science itself. Every correction carries the risk of overcorrection. Where early archaeologists had simplified the past into stories of conquest, some of their successors romanticised it into a lost age of peace. Both sought meaning in fragments. The clay figurines were real. Their worshippers, if they existed, left no text to confirm what those figures meant. But human imagination, when faced with silence, tends to fill the gaps with its own needs. The goddess theory reflected a generation's desire for balance. Between man and nature, reason and feeling, progress and loss. There were other contributors to this wave of reinterpretation. Writers like Jacquetta Hawkes and James Mellart began describing Neolithic societies as complex and symbolically rich, emphasising art and domestic life over warfare. Archaeological reconstructions in museums shifted tone. Scenes of hunting and conflict gave way to those of pottery making, weaving and ceremony. The public began to see the prehistoric world not as brutish survival, but as creative continuity. It was a humanization of prehistory, even if some details leaned more poetic than empirical. What makes this chapter in archaeology important is not whether the goddess existed as Gimbutas imagined her, but how the theory changed the discipline's approach. It forced scholars to reconsider art, symbolism and social structure as legitimate subjects of scientific study. Before this period, prehistory was dominated by bones and stones. After it, ideas about ritual and identity entered the conversation. Excavators began recording figurine placement, hearth patterns, and spatial arrangements with greater care. In that sense, the goddess returned not to reclaim worship, but to remind scientists that humanity is as much a symbolic species as a practical one. Still, the pendulum's swing toward ideology showed the limits of interpretation. Some figurines once labelled as fertility idols have since been reclassified as teaching tools, ancestor figures, or simply household decorations. But even when those corrections came, they owed their existence to the questions Gimbutas had dared to ask. Her work illustrated a broader truth about discovery, that science often advances through competing stories. Each generation, armed with its own worldview, reads the same artefacts differently. In the archives of the 1970s, one can still read field notes full of cautious wonder. Archaeologists kneeling in Balkan soil, brushing away centuries of dust from clay figurines, knew they were touching something ancient, something human in a way that transcended data. The mystery was irresistible. Even skeptics admitted that the abundance of female-shaped figures pointed to some cultural focus on fertility, continuity, or ancestry. The problem was never the evidence, only the leap from evidence to certainty. And certainty is the one thing the past rarely offers. By the late 1970s, the goddess hypothesis had become both a scholarly debate and a cultural phenomenon. Gimbutas herself, speaking near the end of her career, acknowledged that interpretation would always evolve. She called her vision a poetic reconstruction, a phrase that perfectly captured the blend of science and imagination that archaeology sometimes requires. Her critics were right to demand rigour. Her admirers were right to value wonder. Between them lies the space where truth slowly emerges. In the end, this was less a revolution than a reminder. Every era translates the past in its own language. The 19th century found order and conquest in the bones. The mid-20th century found stability and family around the fire. The 1960s sought renewal in clay. Each reflection reveals the questions people were asking in their own time. Archaeology is not a mirror of ideology, but a witness to its evolution. If there is a quiet lesson in this story, it is that meaning, like soil, must be sifted carefully. Figurines, no matter how mysterious, are fragments, not verdicts. The goddess who returned in the 1960s did not resurrect an ancient faith. She revived curiosity. And curiosity, however imperfect, remains the truest form of devotion science can offer. Imagine this. A trowel strikes not a stone or a bone, but a dark patch of soil barely larger than a coin. The archaeologist kneeling above it pauses, brushes gently, and realizes that the faint stain in the dirt is all that remains of a wooden post, rotted away thousands of years ago. Around it, layers of ash, seeds, and microscopic shell fragments lie packed together like a book waiting to be read. This moment, quiet, patient, almost invisible, marks the beginning of a revolution. Not of grand discoveries or golden artifacts, but of attention itself. In the 1970s, archaeology began to look smaller. It stopped asking only what people built and started asking what they dropped, burned, spilled, or swept aside. The trash heaps, hearth remains, and forgotten corners of excavation grids began to speak louder than temples or monuments ever could. Until this era, archaeology had been dominated by architecture and art. The big, durable things. Civilizations were judged by their monuments, pyramids, palaces, walls. But as microscopes, chemical assays, and sediment sampling entered the field, the scale of inquiry shifted. Researchers realized that the grand narratives of history often rested on the tiniest of foundations. A grain of pollen, a smear of residue on a pot, a fragment of bone smaller than a fingernail. Each carried information invisible to the naked eye, but rich in meaning. It was as if the discipline had learned to listen at a new frequency. This change didn't happen overnight. It emerged from frustration as much as curiosity. By the late 1960s, the so-called New Archaeology movement had challenged scholars to treat the past not as a collection of relics, but as a system, an ecology of behaviour, climate, and material exchange. To understand such a system, one needed to look at every trace, not just the beautiful ones. The field became less about treasure and more about pattern. This approach required new tools and, more importantly, new patience. Soil was no longer something to be removed in layers, it was the archive itself. The pioneers of microarchaeology learned to see significance in what earlier generations would have discarded. Through pollen analysis, palynology, scientists could reconstruct ancient environments with surprising precision. Each pollen grain, under a microscope, revealed what plants once grew nearby, what season it was, and sometimes even what the climate felt like. Sediment cores drilled from lake beds and peat bogs began to map the long rhythm of vegetation and drought, linking human settlement patterns to environmental shifts. A handful of dust could now speak for an entire valley. In the same decade, residue analysis transformed how we understood pottery. Archaeologists began dissolving carbonized films from the insides of ancient jars and grinding stones, finding traces of milk, blood, and plant oils. These chemical ghosts recorded meals long forgotten. A single burnt crust could reveal diet, trade, and seasonality. Suddenly, the kitchen replaced the temple as a window into civilization. Every scrap of organic matter became data. Fish scales trapped in hearth ash, starch grains embedded in tools, tiny flecks of obsidian buried in midden piles. The ancient world, once known only through art and architecture, began to reveal its smells, textures, and daily routines. One of the great breakthroughs of this era was faunal microsorting, the systematic study of animal bone fragments. Before this method matured, broken bones were often ignored as debris, but under magnification, specialists noticed patterns in cut marks, fractures, and burn residues that hinted at hunting, cooking, and sharing behaviours. These studies began to correct assumptions made by earlier generations. Not every assemblage of bones meant a hunting site. Sometimes it meant communal feasting, ritual disposal, or the slow accumulation of domestic waste. Archaeologists were beginning to see nuance instead of narrative. The tools of this new approach were modest. Sieves, microscopes, centrifuges, and notebooks filled with numbers instead of adjectives. But their impact was profound. The emphasis shifted from the extraordinary to the everyday, from monuments to maintenance. Excavation reports grew longer, their illustrations more technical, their language more cautious. The scientist replaced the storyteller. It wasn't that wonder disappeared, it simply became quantitative. This methodological revolution also redefined what counted as evidence. In the 19th century, the most valued finds were statues and gold. In the early 20th, they were burials and weapons. By the late 20th, the most precious artifact might be a spoonful of soil. Archaeology was becoming less romantic, perhaps, but more human. It turned its gaze toward the ordinary, the people who cooked, built, and swept, not just those who ruled or fought. The revolution of the small things also changed how excavations were conducted. Teams began to collect bulk samples from every layer of soil, rather than just the ones with visible artifacts. Laboratories sprouted beside dig sites, equipped with microscopes and flotation tanks. The latter, large basins used to separate light organic material from heavier sediment, allowed seeds and charred plant remains to float to the surface, revealing ancient agriculture in astonishing detail. For the first time, researchers could distinguish between cultivated and wild grains, between deliberate harvest and incidental gathering. It was slow work, often dull to watch, but it produced insights no monument could offer. Perhaps the most symbolic shift came in how archaeologists described their own profession. Where once they saw themselves as explorers, they now spoke of themselves as analysts, archivists, even detectives. The romantic figure with a whip and hat gave way to the quiet scientist with a brush and a vial. Excavations grew smaller but deeper, more focused on controlled sampling than on spectacle. Each artifact was recorded in situ, every context drawn, photographed and logged. The discipline had matured into a dialogue with the invisible. By the 1980s, this approach had transformed understanding of ancient economies and ecologies. Studies of charred seeds, for example, began revealing how early farmers rotated crops and managed soil fertility. Microscopic wear on stone tools showed that many implements once thought to be weapons were actually used for processing plants or hides. Even the study of microfauna, insects, snails and rodents, provided clues about ancient living conditions. The presence of house mice, for instance, marked the beginnings of permanent human settlement. What once seemed trivial became the foundation for reconstructing entire lifeways. This period also saw the emergence of geoarchaeology, the marriage of geology and archaeology. Soil chemistry, mineral magnetism and micromorphology, the microscopic study of sediment structure, revealed how sites formed and decayed. Researchers learned to read the ground itself as an artifact, a record of floods, fires and footsteps. A patch of clay might preserve the imprint of a reed mat. A lens of ash might mark a single night's fire from 10,000 years ago. The ground had memory, and for the first time we had the instruments to hear it. The intellectual effect of this micro-scale thinking was subtle, but transformative. It undermined the old habit of building sweeping generalizations from a handful of spectacular finds. Instead, it demanded caution and context. Archaeologists began publishing not only conclusions, but also margins of error, chemical uncertainties and sampling limits. The discipline had entered its age of humility, a recognition that precision is more powerful than grandiosity. Looking back, it's striking how this quiet revolution changed our imagination of the past. The stories became less cinematic but more believable. The cave was no longer a stage for heroes. It was a household full of crumbs, soot and footprints. The settlement was not an empire but a system of maintenance. And in that ordinariness lay a deeper kind of wonder. The soil itself became a kind of scripture, one that recorded not the victories of kings, but the persistence of hands. If there is beauty in science, it is often found in correction. The archaeologists of the 1970s and 80s did not set out to romanticize or demystify the past. They simply looked closer, and in doing so, found a different kind of grandeur. The story of humanity was no longer written in marble and myth, but in ash and pollen, delicate, measurable, and profoundly alive. The revolution of the small things taught us that history does not shout, it whispers. And sometimes, the most truthful sound in the world is the scrape of a brush over a grain of sand that no one thought to notice before. a hillside above the ancient town of Birka, Sweden, quiet under the northern sun. Grass moves in the wind over small mounds that once marked graves of Viking-age men and women, traders, soldiers, farmers, and travellers. Beneath one of those mounds, discovered in the year 1878, lay a burial that would become one of the most discussed in archaeological history. A skeleton resting among weapons, 2 horses, and a game board. It was catalogued quickly and confidently as a high-status warrior, a commander perhaps. The field notes described it plainly: male, approximately 35 to 40 years old. For more than a century that label remained unchallenged. Textbooks cited the grave as proof of military hierarchy in Viking society. Artists illustrated the man of Birka standing proud with sword and shield, a symbol of northern valour. But in the quiet language of bones, the truth waited. The grave, numbered Bias 581, was not the largest or most ornate at Birka, but it was distinctive. When excavated by Hjalmar Stolpe during his multi-year survey of the site, it revealed an unusual completeness, a full set of weapons: sword, axe, spear, arrows, and 2 shields. The body was laid upright in a seated position, flanked by the skeletons of 2 horses, 1 mare, 1 stallion. At its feet lay a gaming board and pieces, a sign often interpreted as a strategist's tool, not a mere warrior's. In the late 19th century, this configuration seemed unmistakable. It belonged to a man of rank. In the logic of the era, such grave goods spoke louder than anatomy. The presence of weaponry equalled masculinity. Leadership equalled manhood. For decades, that assumption remained untouched, not because the evidence was perfect, but because it was convenient. The bones themselves were fragile, and osteological methods in the 19th century were not precise. Moreover, the early discipline of archaeology tended to read artifacts through cultural expectations. A sword in a grave was a clear signature, no need for further proof, and so, the Birka warrior joined the pantheon of Viking heroes, drawn on posters and museum walls, reinforcing a narrative that had stood since the sagas were first translated. Men fought, women waited. But archaeology, like time, is patient. In the late 20th century, Birka became a subject of renewed interest. Modern techniques, radiocarbon dating, isotopic studies, and finally genetic sequencing, began to re-examine old finds. The bones of BJ 581 were among them. For years they sat quietly in storage at the Swedish History Museum, tagged and filed, until a small research project in the early 21st century aimed to redocument all the skeletal material from classic Viking burials. When researchers opened the boxes from the Birka grave, they noticed something odd. The pelvic bones, long assumed male, were gracile. The jaw lacked the pronounced robustness typical of male skeletons. Measurements suggested otherwise. Could the catalogue have been wrong? To be certain, a team led by Charlotte Hidden-Stjerna Jonsson and colleagues performed a full genomic analysis in 2017. It was not meant to be sensational, just a confirmation of skeletal identification. But when the results came back, the sequence carried no Y chromosome. The warrior of Birka, the textbook male of a century's teaching, was genetically female. The data were repeated, verified, and published in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology. The announcement sent ripples through archaeology and the public alike. Not because the existence of a woman with weapons was unimaginable, Viking sagas themselves mention shield maidens, but because of what the discovery revealed about how science forms its assumptions. The shock was not biological, it was epistemological. For more than 100 years, the evidence had been present. The bones had not changed. Only the framework around them had. The initial misclassification was not malicious, simply habitual. In the 19th century, context was king. The rule was that artifacts defined identity. If weapons surrounded a body, the person must have been a warrior, and warriors were men. This circular logic had become invisible, a quiet loop of inference. The Birka case forced scholars to confront that loop directly. The re-evaluation of BJ 581 didn't only rewrite a single grave, it reawakened a question about how gender, status, and occupation were inferred in prehistoric archaeology. The weapons were real, the horses real, the burial rich and deliberate. There was no sign of intrusive artifacts, no later contamination. Whoever this individual was, they had been buried with full martial honour. The pattern of grave goods matched those of high-ranking officers in the Viking world, strategic figures rather than frontline fighters. The gaming pieces too suggested tactical command. So who was this person? The simplest answer: a warrior, possibly even a leader. The rest is speculation, yet the implications spread beyond the burial itself. The case reminded archaeologists of how deeply interpretive their field is. Objects do not declare their meaning, humans assign it. For over a century, BJ 581 had served as an emblem of masculinity, used to define patterns of hierarchy, economy, and even religion. Now, the same evidence told a different story. It was not that women warriors were suddenly discovered, it was that science had finally learned to question its reflexes. The burial hadn't changed, the lens had. What makes this episode so scientifically rich is the precision of its correction. The DNA sequencing, isotopic analysis, and osteological reassessment all pointed in the same direction. The bones were from a biological female, with no signs of misplacement from another grave. The horses, weapons, and gaming set were all found in primary context. The data stood firm against attempts to explain it away. The more it was tested, the clearer it became that this was not an error of excavation, but an error of interpretation. There's an almost poetic symmetry to that realization. The Burqa warrior story began with a confident label and ended with a quiet retraction. Between those points lies the history of archaeology itself, a discipline that grew from assumption to analysis, from narrative to data. The correction does not diminish the early excavators, it honours them. Their meticulous recording preserved enough context for modern science to test their conclusions. The humility to re-examine old evidence is one of archaeology's greatest strengths. In the years since the re-identification, the Burqa burial has become a touchstone for scientific self-correction. Museums updated their displays, papers re-evaluated comparative graves, and students began studying BJ 581 not only as an individual, but as a case study in methodology. The site now embodies a broader principle, that no conclusion is sacred. The soil remains the same. It is our reading of it that evolves. Standing today in the Burqa Museum, one can see the reconstructed figure of the warrior. Armour, sword, game pieces, all arranged as before. But the figure beneath the helmet is no longer labelled by assumption. It is labelled by data. The story is richer, not because it was rewritten, but because it was refined. This discovery also highlights the scientific truth that corrections often reveal more complexity, not less. The question is not whether Viking women fought, that may always remain debated, but rather how carefully we must define what warrior means. Leadership, planning, and command are as much parts of warfare as battle itself. The Burqa individual may have been a tactician, a chieftain, or a symbolic figure. The burial's composition suggests authority regardless of biological sex. In that sense, B581 is not a feminist victory or a cultural provocation. It is an archaeological triumph. It shows that science can admit its mistakes and grow stronger for it. The grave reminds us that evidence is not political, it is persistent. For over 100 years, a set of bones lay silently beneath a label that was slightly wrong. And when technology finally advanced enough to listen, the bones spoke back, not with ideology, but with sequence data and geometry. They whispered a quiet reminder that every story, even one carved in stone, can still surprise us. In the end, that is the beauty of archaeology. It's not a march towards certainty, but a slow dance with humility. Each discovery adds a page, each correction rewrites the margins. The Burqa warrior will continue to teach, not only about Vikings or warfare, but about how knowledge itself changes through time. The ground does not lie, it waits. And when it finally answers, it does so in the simplest of voices and the kind that says, "Look again." A dusty archive room filled not with bones or pottery, but with spreadsheets, servers, and silent numbers glowing on computer screens. Here, archaeology has no smell of soil or echo of trowel scraping rock. Instead, it hums with the quiet rhythm of data. The late 20th century brought a revolution not in excavation but in computation. When archaeologists began entering entire excavation records into digital form, something strange happened. The patterns started arguing back. By the 1990s, the field of archaeology had matured into a blend of science and statistics. Thousands of graves, once isolated in museum drawers and handwritten ledgers, could finally be compared on the same scale. Computers, crude by today's standards, processed information faster than any human could. Burial types, artifact associations, and skeletal attributes began to appear not as isolated case studies, but as data sets. And data sets, unlike human historians, do not care about stories. They only know patterns. When researchers started feeding data from European burial sites into statistical models, the results often didn't match the expectations that had dominated for decades. The old visual method, strong bones equal man, delicate ones equal woman, began to fracture under the weight of probabilities. Bayesian analysis, a statistical tool borrowed from mathematics, allowed scientists to test the likelihood of different interpretations rather than assume one. It could weigh multiple variables, artifact types, isotopic data, grave depth, spatial arrangement, and calculate which explanations fit best. In that new digital light, gendered patterns blurred. Take the early Bronze and Iron Age cemeteries of Central Europe. For generations they had been described as models of gender division, weapons and armour with men, jewellery and ceramics with women. Yet when the numbers were fed into large-scale models, the binary dissolved. Many graves carried mixed assemblages, a spear beside a spindle whorl, a necklace beside a knife. Individually, these were dismissed as exceptions. Collectively, they formed a pattern that refused to be dismissed. The data suggested that symbolic associations in death were more complex than a simple male-female split. Some archaeologists resisted this interpretation. Others leaned into it with cautious fascination. What Bayesian modelling revealed wasn't that gender didn't exist, but that the archaeological record had been filtered through modern cultural expectations. The ancient people themselves had their own logic, one we might not fully understand. Their rituals, beliefs, and symbols often defied modern categories, and when examined mathematically, these societies began to look less like reflections of our assumptions and more like foreign worlds in their own right. In the 2000s, as software improved, so did resolution. Meta-analyses, studies that combine the results of many smaller studies, began to dominate academic journals. Archaeologists could now look across entire regions rather than isolated sites. From Scandinavia to the Mediterranean, they found consistent irregularities, burials of biological males with decorative items once labelled feminine, and vice versa. Even more intriguing were graves without any gendered goods at all, the majority in fact. For every richly equipped burial that had once anchored gender theories, there were dozens of simpler ones that spoke of identity without symbols. One of the most powerful moments in this data-driven shift came from work done in Central and Eastern Europe. Researchers compared hundreds of graves across multiple cultures using standardized typologies, feeding thousands of entries into databases. They didn't set out to challenge gender norms. They were simply testing correlations between artifact types and osteological sex. The statistical link was weaker than expected. The model showed high overlap, suggesting that many artifact categories, once considered gender exclusive, were not predictive at all. In plainer words, the things people were buried with didn't always match the things we thought defined them. That finding sent quiet ripples through the field, not in the form of controversy, but curiosity. What if the old frameworks had simply been too coarse? What if societies in prehistory used entirely different axes of identity, clan, craft, age, belief or role, that we've flattened into modern notions of sex? Archaeology, for once, wasn't rewriting history with ideology, but with evidence. As one researcher famously joked, spreadsheets have no patriarchy. Numbers simply test what is, not what should be. The introduction of Bayesian modelling also changed how archaeologists thought about time itself. Instead of assigning artefacts to fixed cultural phases, scientists could now model probabilities that certain objects coexisted or overlapped in use. This temporal resolution allowed researchers to see shifts within single cemeteries, how burial customs evolved generation by generation. In some places, patterns of weapon burials increased as societies became more hierarchical, while in others they declined, replaced by ornaments or imported goods. The point was not who buried whom, but how social identity itself moved through time. Even the tone of academic writing changed. The confident declaratives of early archaeology, this man was a warrior, this woman was a mother, gave way to probability statements. This individual may have been associated with martial status. That small shift in language reflected a larger cultural maturity, the realization that science gained strength through uncertainty, not assertion. In this sense, the statistical turn of the 1990s and 2000s brought humility back into the field. It reminded archaeologists that most of prehistory remains silent, and that silence deserves respect. There were humorous moments too. When one team at the University of Cambridge ran early grave data sets through software designed for economic modelling, the algorithm categorised burials as investment portfolios. Spears, shields, ornaments, all weighted like financial assets. The team laughed, but the exercise revealed something profound. That human life, even in the distant past, followed rational patterns of display and exchange that can still be mapped mathematically. Numbers, it turned out, could find meaning even in ritual. By the 2010s, entire subfields like quantitative archaeology and computational anthropology had emerged. New journals were founded, dedicated to modelling ancient behaviour using algorithms and probability trees. The revolution of small data from the previous generation had evolved into the revolution of big data. The technology that once built pyramids of speculation now built spreadsheets of precision, and as the data sets grew, they began to reveal something subtle but universal, that ancient societies were more varied than the tidy categories we impose upon them. In many ways, this was archaeology finally catching up with itself. The field that began in the 19th century as a narrative enterprise, telling stories about man the hunter and woman the gatherer, had evolved into a science capable of measuring its own biases. It didn't need to moralize or deconstruct, it just needed to count. Every new database, every isotopic assay, every reanalyzed burial was another correction. Together they built a picture of human complexity that no ideology, ancient or modern, could flatten. When you look at a digital map of graves across Europe today, glowing points, each one a life long gone, you can see the rhythm of prehistory take form. Patterns of trade, diet, belief, and craft emerge from the noise. But gender, that category we once thought absolute, appears only faintly. It flickers, changes, and blurs across centuries, as if identity itself were a moving target. For modern scientists, that realization is not threatening, it's liberating. The past is not a mirror for our politics, it's a laboratory for humility. The beauty of statistical archaeology is that it replaces narrative certainty with probabilistic truth. It does not claim to know who people were, only what the evidence supports. It can't tell us what it felt like to be a Bronze Age child, a Celtic chieftain, or a Neolithic potter. But it can show how the patterns of their lives overlap and diverge. And in that patient arithmetic of centuries, there's something oddly comforting. A quiet, mathematical respect for human diversity, long before we had the language to describe it. In the end, the numbers speak in their own timeless dialect. They do not argue or moralize or pretend. They simply add, subtract and reveal. And sometimes, in that silence, we hear the clearest message of all, that truth, like time, is not loyal to any story. Imagine this. 9,000 years ago, in the high plains of what is now Peru, a group of hunters gathered under the thin mountain air. They were skinning the carcass of a large animal, something like a vicuña or perhaps a deer, its bones glinting in the light. The ground was hard and cold, the smell of blood mixed with smoke. When one of them fell ill and never rose again, the others did what humans have always done. They buried her with the tools she'd used to live. The spear points, scrapers, and flakes of obsidian that once sliced through hide and tendon became offerings to the earth. And for thousands of years she waited there in silence until the 21st century came looking. The site was called Willamaya Pacha. At first glance it seemed unremarkable, just another pre-agricultural burial in the Andean Altiplano. The archaeologists uncovered a skeleton laid on its side, surrounded by a hunter's toolkit. Finely made projectile points, flint scrapers, cutting tools, and flakes from the process of resharpening blades. Every detail spoke of a person skilled in hunting and butchery, someone deeply familiar with the anatomy of animals. In older textbooks, that toolkit would have told a simple story, a man's grave. But as the bones were cleaned and studied, the evidence began to disagree. The skeleton was slender, its pelvis wide, and the dental structure suggested a female. The team hesitated. For over a century, burials like this had been classified based on artifact context first, anatomy second. This one didn't fit the pattern. They took samples for ancient DNA analysis and for carbon and nitrogen isotope testing, techniques that would have been science fiction only decades earlier. When the results came back, the picture became clearer. The DNA confirmed biological sex as female. The isotope ratios, measured from tiny portions of bone collagen, revealed a diet rich in animal protein, far higher than that of individuals identified as foragers or plant gatherers. Whoever she was, she hadn't been living off roots or fruits, she had been hunting. The discovery, first published in the early 2000s, sent a ripple through archaeology not because it was controversial, but because it was statistically meaningful. Alongside Willamaya Pacha, researchers compiled a database of early burials across the Americas. Out of 27 individuals associated with hunting toolkits, 11 were identified as female. That ratio, almost equal, suggested something striking: that large game hunting had not been an exclusively male activity during the late Pleistocene and early Holocene. But the story wasn't about proving any ideology. It was about the method, the way science corrects its own sight. The early explorers of the Andes in the 20th century had made field notes about these same kinds of burials, but had labelled them without question. The spear points meant man, the tools meant warrior. Only now, with molecular techniques, could scientists check their assumptions against biology. And what they found was not a reversal of gender roles, but a broadening of what survival looked like in early human societies. The Andes were a hard environment, thin oxygen, fluctuating temperatures, sparse resources. In such conditions, every capable individual likely participated in the hunt. Strength mattered, yes, but so did knowledge of animal behaviour tracking and tool repair. Hunting wasn't a performance of masculinity, it was a necessity of ecology. When you view the burial through that lens, the spear points are not symbols of gender, but of expertise. The Willamaya Pacha find also demonstrated how much of our prehistoric narrative was built on a narrow sampling of sites, mostly European, mostly lowland, mostly agricultural. The high-altitude Americas were a different evolutionary laboratory. Here, mobility was survival, and division of labour may have followed pragmatic lines rather than rigid ones. Archaeologists studying wear patterns on the stone tools found at the site noticed micro-polish marks consistent with repeated use by small hands, fingers that applied precise pressure to flake stone or sliced tendon. It was an insight only visible through microscopy, yet it changed the entire story. The isotopic data were equally revealing. The nitrogen-15 ratios, slightly elevated, indicated that the woman's diet included a significant portion of high trophic level protein, meat from animals near the top of the food chain. That dietary fingerprint couldn't be faked by occasional consumption. It reflected a lifetime of participation in hunting and butchery. Carbon isotopes showed that the prey species consumed came from open grassland environments, not forested valleys. In other words, she had lived and worked in the same terrain as the hunters who chased herds. After the publication of the findings, the discussion among archaeologists was less about gender and more about method. How many other assumptions had been fossilized in the literature simply because no one had checked them? The Wilhelmina-Pacha burial became a case study in scientific humility. The researchers, led by Randy Haas, didn't claim to have rewritten prehistory. They simply followed the data. The result was a quiet reminder that evidence doesn't respect tradition. What's even more interesting is how the finding fits into a broader pattern emerging from across the world. When similar isotope and DNA techniques were applied to Siberian, East African and Arctic burials, comparable anomalies appeared, individuals with hunting diets and toolkits that didn't match their presumed sex based on visual analysis. The global pattern implied that early human subsistence strategies were more flexible than the binary categories later imposed by settled agricultural societies. Hunters and gatherers, it seems, were far more adaptable and interdependent than our modern stereotypes allow. There is a poetic irony in how these insights arrive, not through political argument, but through chemistry. Carbon-13, nitrogen-15, mitochondrial haplogroups, enamel isotopes. All of them indifferent to modern debates, all of them whispering quiet corrections from the molecules of our ancient bones. Science, at its best, doesn't shout about ideology. It just subtracts error until the shape of truth appears. If you could stand beside that ancient burial today, you'd see a shallow pit ringed with rocks, the bones now carefully conserved in museum drawers, the tools displayed behind glass. Nothing dramatic, no banner proclaiming revelation. Just the stillness of data doing its slow work. The woman buried there didn't know she would one day dismantle a century of assumptions. She didn't live to prove anything. She lived because that's what people do. Adapt, survive, and pass on their knowledge. The lesson is not that she hunted like a man, but that she hunted like a human. And this is what archaeology is learning to see again. The past is not a catalogue of gender roles or moral archetypes. It's a record of how intelligence, endurance, and cooperation evolved in countless forms. Every burial we uncover holds a fragment of that larger pattern, a reminder that survival was never a performance of ideology, but of necessity. By looking at this 9,000-year-old grave through the lens of DNA and isotopes, we're not rewriting history so much as restoring it, removing the dust of interpretation and letting the evidence breathe. The result is something both humbling and inspiring. Proof that our ancestors were more adaptable, more pragmatic, and perhaps more equal in survival than we ever imagined. In the end, the Wilhelmina-Pacha woman stands not as a symbol, but as a statistic, a single data point that, when joined with others, reveals a clearer picture of what humanity really looked like before stories got in the way. Imagine this. A slab of chert rests in your palm. It's cold, weighty, and perfectly ordinary, the kind of rock you might step over without noticing. But if you strike it at the right angle, the surface fractures with a whisper of precision. A flake comes off, sharp as glass. That's the moment where archaeology begins, not in museums or books, but in the simple geometry of breaking stone. For over 2.5 million years, humans and their ancestors turned this motion into survival. And yet, for most of the last century, we've quietly argued over who got to hold the hammerstone. The late 20th century brought an answer that, once again, had been there all along, in the physics. In the 1980s, a new generation of researchers began testing stone tool technology through what they called experimental archaeology. Instead of theorizing about ancient craftsmanship, they tried it themselves, sitting on open plains, striking flint cores, cutting hides, and scraping meat from bone. What they found, after decades of bruised knuckles and cut fingers, was simple and oddly liberating. The rock didn't care who hit it. Tool-making, it turned out, wasn't limited by sex, height, or muscle strength. It was limited by geometry, patience, and practice. A controlled strike requires precision, not force. A flick of the wrist, not the strength of a shoulder. When analysts compared the flakes made by trained male and female knappers, the differences vanished into noise. Flake length, angle, and edge sharpness depended on experience alone. At first, this line of research was treated as a curiosity, a kind of intellectual hobby. Archaeologists, after all, had always been collectors of results, not replicators of behaviour. But as high-resolution microscopes entered the field, the stakes changed. The new subdiscipline of useware analysis revealed microscopic polish and striations on ancient stone surfaces, marks left by specific tasks: cutting meat, scraping hide, carving wood, or harvesting plants. When these traces were catalogued across hundreds of sites, the old picture of gendered labour dissolved. Many artefacts once assumed to be hunting tools, for instance, showed polish consistent with food processing or plant work, and vice versa. The categories were never as fixed as we imagined. By the 1990s, computers allowed researchers to quantify these wear patterns statistically. The data showed overlaps so broad that no tool type could be reliably assigned to a specific gendered activity. A spear point might have been used by anyone capable of throwing, a scraper by anyone with the patience to tan hide. The most famous phrase to come out of these conferences came from an exhausted analyst in a flint lab in the Netherlands, who reportedly said, after measuring thousands of edges, "The rock never asked who threw it." It was both a joke and a lesson. Archaeology, for much of its history, had assigned human stories to inanimate things. A heavy spear meant a man, a grinding stone meant a woman, but the objects themselves have no pronouns, only functions, contexts, and scars. Every tool carries the memory of its use, not its owner. One of the breakthroughs of this period came from experiments in biomechanics. Researchers filmed volunteers of various builds and backgrounds, performing classic tasks: hammering cores, shaping flakes, hafting points. Using motion capture sensors, they discovered that effective flint knapping relies on rhythm and control, not size or power. The angle of percussion was everything. Even a child could produce expert flakes after a few hours of instruction. When these results were overlaid with skeletal studies of muscle attachment sites in ancient bones, the conclusion deepened. Morphology alone couldn't define behaviour. Many robust skeletons, once labelled male warriors, might simply belong to people accustomed to physical work. Digging, grinding, carrying, tasks shared widely in mobile societies. The shift wasn't ideological, it was mechanical. The same stone technology replicated by dozens of labs around the world yielded identical outcomes regardless of who wielded the hammerstone. Archaeology was beginning to confront its oldest bias, mistaking cultural storytelling for physical law. One of the most illustrative studies came from a team in Australia in the early 2000s. They analysed thousands of stone flakes from open-air sites spanning 10,000 years and trained both men and women in identical knapping sequences. When measured under a digital microscope, the flakes from each group were statistically indistinguishable. The only variable that mattered was practice. The same conclusion echoed through Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Every culture that mastered stone understood the same truth. Precision outlasts prejudice. This re-evaluation also changed how archaeologists interpret the record of technological innovation. Instead of envisioning a linear chain of inventors, one brilliant ancestor passing knowledge down a patriarchal line, experimental archaeology revealed that innovation often emerged communally. Someone discovered a sharper angle, someone else found a better hammer material, and another found a more efficient way to hold the core. Over generations, these small improvements compounded into revolutions. There was no single genius inventor, just a web of accumulated practice. One could argue that stone tools themselves are the most democratic artifacts ever made. Every flake is unique, yet every flake obeys the same physics. It's one of the few technologies that truly connects all of humanity, from the first Homo habilis on the African savannas to Holocene farmers reshaping obsidian in Anatolia. The language of stone is universal: percussion, angle, fracture. This universality also extends to the emotional texture of the work. Many modern flint knappers describe a kind of meditative calm in the process, a rhythm of thought and sound. There's something ancient in the idea that understanding a tool means learning to break something perfectly. That may be why tool-making marks the dawn of symbolic cognition, the moment an individual sees not just a rock, but potential. That's the birth of imagination itself. By the 21st century, the combination of wear analysis, micro-residue testing, and experimental replication turned stone tools from static relics into dynamic data. Researchers could now tell what plants were processed, what animals were butchered, even whether ochre was mixed on a particular surface. This precision stripped away the need for cultural assumptions entirely. The results spoke for themselves. Sharp edges don't discriminate. The irony, of course, is that this revolution in interpretation began not with new ideology, but with humility. Archaeologists stopped trying to guess what people should have been doing and started testing what the evidence could sustain. The change was methodological, not moral. By focusing on the physics of survival, the discipline rediscovered something older than theory: the quiet equality of skill. Today, when students of archaeology pick up their first replica hand axe or flint core, they don't think about who invented it. They think about how it works. They learn to listen to the sound of stone on stone, that sharp, ringing crack that hasn't changed in millions of years. It's a kind of conversation across time, one that speaks of intelligence, patience, and repetition, not gender or power. Every artifact, no matter how small, carries the echo of its maker's intent: to cut, to scrape, to survive. But it doesn't carry their story. That part we invent later. And sometimes, when the science improves, the stories fall away, leaving only the artifact itself, silent but unbroken. In the end, that silence is its own kind of truth. The tools didn't care who made them, only that someone did. The flint flaked cleanly, the edge cut well, and another day of life continued. If there's a moral buried in the stone, it's not about ownership or identity. It's about continuity, the long chain of humans learning, striking, and passing that knowledge on. And perhaps, if we listen closely enough, the rock is still speaking, not to tell us who we were, but to remind us that intelligence has always been a shared inheritance, waiting to be rediscovered, one flake at a time. A dimly lit museum basement lined with steel cabinets that hum faintly in the quiet. Each drawer holds small boxes wrapped in yellowing paper, labelled in handwriting so faded it looks like fossilized ink. Inside are fragments of pottery, flakes of flint, pieces of bone. Things once touched by hands that have long since vanished. For over a century they've slept under dust and catalogue numbers. But now, for the first time in decades, they are waking up. Not through excavation or shovel, but through data. Archaeology is often imagined as a field of deserts and trenches, of hats and brushes and endless sunlight. In reality, much of the discipline now lives behind computer screens, where the past is rediscovered not by digging new holes, but by re-examining what was already found. The real revolution of the 21st century isn't happening in the ground. It's happening in the archives. Across the world, a quiet movement is underway. The digitization of the archaeological record. Museum curators, data scientists, and field archaeologists are scanning thousands of excavation logs, notebooks, and photographs once thought too fragile to handle. Each page, each grainy image, becomes a high-resolution data point, searchable and comparable in ways its original author could never imagine. What used to be locked in regional museums and handwritten field notes is now open to a generation armed with artificial intelligence, photogrammetry, and pattern recognition algorithms. And with that access comes correction, sometimes gentle, sometimes startling. The process is meticulous. Old glass plate negatives are digitized and color-corrected, their original shadows restored. Excavation notebooks from the early 20th century, written in pencil by candlelight, are scanned and transcribed, then cross-referenced against artifact inventories. The goal isn't nostalgia, it's error detection. When you line up a century of records, small inconsistencies appear. Mismatched catalogue numbers, mislabeled strata, bones catalogued under the wrong layer. These seem like clerical footnotes, but in archaeology, context is everything. One missorted bone can change the age of an entire site. In 2019, a project in Britain called the Re-Excavation Archive Initiative rescanned more than 20,000 excavation photos taken between the 1920s and 1970s. AI-based image analysis revealed subtle stratigraphic details, soil bands, stone alignments that the human eye had missed in the original prints. In one case, what was thought to be a random scatter of stones turned out to form the base of a collapsed wall. The discovery didn't require a new dig, just new eyes. Photogrammetry, the technique of reconstructing 3D models from 2D photographs, has become archaeology's new trowel. Old excavation photos, when aligned and processed, can recreate the dig sites in virtual space. Entire trenches once backfilled and built over can now be redug digitally. You can stand virtually where an archaeologist stood in 1932 and look around in 3 dimensions. Layers reappear. Artifacts return to their precise positions. It's not romantic, it's computational resurrection. Artificial intelligence has added another layer to this awakening. By training algorithms on known artifact types, pottery styles, lithic typologies, bone morphology, AI can flag mislabeled objects or identify patterns invisible to intuition. At the University of Tübingen, a neural network trained on Paleolithic stone tools discovered that several distinct tool types, described in the early 1900s, were actually variants of the same reduction sequence. In other words, a century of typological distinctions dissolved overnight into the smoother gradient of real human behaviour. The algorithm had no agenda. It simply saw what the data contained. Perhaps the most moving aspect of this digital archaeology is its humility. It's not about rewriting the past. It's about cleaning the dust off our own methods. When early field archaeologists documented their finds, they did so with extraordinary care but limited tools. Measurements were taken with string and compass, photographs were monochrome and low contrast, and stratigraphy was mapped by hand. These records were feats of endurance, not precision. Now, by digitizing them, we are honouring that work, translating it into a medium that can outlive paper and film. There's also a kind of poetry in realising how much human fallibility shaped the original record. A mislabeled artefact may not mean negligence. It might reflect the exhaustion of months in the field, or a miscommunication in translation. Early excavators worked without standardized codes or international databases. Their world was local, their taxonomy personal. What we call correction today is often gratitude, the next generation quietly refining what the last left behind. One striking example came from the archives of a Neolithic site in Turkey. For decades, a series of clay figurines were catalogued as ritual idols, each one marked female, due to rounded features. But when those same artifacts were digitally rescanned and modelled in 3 dimensions, researchers noticed fine holes at the base of several, suggesting they were supports or architectural fittings, not statues. The old interpretation fell apart, not through ideology, but through resolution. The figurines weren't goddesses or fertility icons, they were part of a roof. The same digital precision has uncovered lost excavations, literally. In 2022, a team working in Italy digitised aerial reconnaissance photos from the 1940s taken by military pilots. Eye pattern recognition identified faint rectangular outlines in ploughed fields that matched the grid of a Roman military camp. The site had been excavated in the 19th century, lost to urban development and forgotten. Its rediscovery didn't involve a single shovel, only the re-examination of old film. What's remarkable is how much more the archive holds. Every museum, every regional depot has drawers of specimens excavated decades ago, but never analysed with modern tools. Micro-CT scans, portable X-ray fluorescence, and high-resolution photography now allow us to look inside sealed objects or detect chemical traces without touching them. Some teams even rephotograph excavation journals under ultraviolet light to reveal faded notes or corrections written in invisible ink. It's as if the archives themselves are whispering, "You missed something." This digital transformation is also changing how archaeology collaborates. Instead of a single team owning a site's data, open databases now allow researchers worldwide to reanalyze the same material. Mistakes no longer fossilize inside a single interpretation. The same way multiple astronomers can observe one star, multiple archaeologists can now observe one trench, virtually, simultaneously, across continents. There's a quiet irony here. The more we digitize, the more human the record becomes. You can see the quirks in handwriting, the field sketches with rain stains, the marginal doodles of tired excavators. AI doesn't erase that humanity. It amplifies it, reminding us that science is built not only on precision but on persistence. Each mislabeled artifact, each misdrawn layer, carries the fingerprint of someone doing their best with the tools of their time. And sometimes the corrections lead to rediscoveries that feel almost poetic. A mislabeled photograph from a 1910 dig in Kenya was recently reclassified using AI object recognition. What was once catalogued as random stone scatter was revealed to be a stone circle, possibly one of the earliest known domestic structures in the region. The image had sat unseen for over a century, waiting for a computer to notice what no one had. So when archaeologists talk about the next great discovery, they're no longer looking for untouched soil. They're looking for overlooked notes, for the pencil mark in the margin that didn't fit a theory, for the photograph that captured something no one recognised at the time. The future of discovery, oddly enough, lives in the past paperwork. And maybe that's the quiet lesson here, that progress doesn't always mean moving forward. Sometimes it means turning around, opening an old drawer and seeing it with new eyes. The ancient world doesn't change, our understanding of it does. And as we hand these digitized records to the next generation, we're not just preserving data, we're preserving humility, the understanding that science, like memory, is a living thing. Somewhere right now, in a basement archive or forgotten storeroom, another mislabeled artifact waits for its second chance. It doesn't care who finds it or what it means, it just wants to be seen accurately, finally as it is. And in that simple act of correction, of seeing clearly, archaeology becomes what it was always meant to be, a mirror held steady against time. Imagine this, a human skull floats, suspended not in air but in data. Every ridge, pore and microscopic groove has been captured in digital form, not by an artist's hand but by beams of invisible light. It turns slowly on a computer screen, its inner chambers glowing in faint colour as if lit from within. No one is touching it. No brushes, no probes, no risk of fracture. And yet, for the first time, scientists can see everything. This is what modern archaeology looks like. A science that now reads bones without ever disturbing them. In the past, every study began with direct handling. Calipers pressed to femurs, scales weighing fragments, eyes measuring angles that depended on the experience of the observer. But today, bones are more often read as data clouds than as objects. The shift began quietly in the late 20th century, with the rise of computed tomography, CT scans, a technology borrowed from medicine that became the archaeologist's new X-ray vision. What doctors used to study the living, researchers now use to study the long dead. CT microscanning takes this idea to an entirely different level. Using X-rays thousands of times finer than clinical machines, scientists can now peer into the internal architecture of ancient bone, the trabecular networks that form its honeycomb structure. Each pattern reveals not just age or health, but lifestyle. The difference between a herder, a farmer, or a warrior isn't always in the shape of their skull or the length of their limbs, but in the microscopic wear inside their bones, how stress and strain carved its story from within. This, in many ways, is the archaeology of the invisible. Once scanned, the bones are converted into three-dimensional models composed of millions of data points. These models can be rotated, sliced, magnified, or measured digitally with precision down to microns. Researchers can now compare dozens of skeletons simultaneously, from different centuries, continents, or species, without moving a single artifact from storage. The physical bones remain in their cases, undisturbed, while their digital twins travel the world. One of the most powerful aspects of this new approach is that it removes the biases built into human interpretation. Traditionally, when osteologists analysed a skeleton, they began by labelling it male or female, young or old, strong or delicate. These categories shaped every observation that followed. But when digital scans are processed through blind protocols, where metadata like sex or region is hidden, algorithms look only at the geometry, not the story. The result is often surprising. Clusters of similar traits emerge that don't align neatly with traditional labels. A femur categorized as female, based on size, might cluster more closely with male bones in structural density, suggesting variation that our categories missed. Three-dimensional morphometrics, the study of biological shape through geometry, has become one of the most elegant tools in this transformation. Instead of measuring bones with rulers and angles, scientists place virtual landmarks across digital models, points along the jaw, the orbital rims, the pelvis. Software then analyzes how these points vary in three-dimensional space, creating a shape map that can be compared across thousands of individuals. The beauty of this system is that it's mathematical, not interpretive. It doesn't assume what a male or female pelvis should look like. It simply measures differences, letting the data reveal its own clusters and gradients. And sometimes, those gradients blur what we thought were boundaries. Morphometric studies have shown that skeletal variation is more continuous than categorical. There are overlapping zones rather than sharp lines, a humbling reminder that biology rarely draws straight ones. Archaeology, like genetics, is learning that variation doesn't like boxes. The same principle applies to how we detect disease, trauma, or diet. Micro-CT scans can reveal stress lines, healed fractures, or even ancient infections at scales too small to see with the naked eye. By stacking digital slices, scientists reconstruct virtual cross-sections of the skeleton, not just its surface, but its life history. The internal texture of bone, once destroyed by sampling, can now be studied endlessly in digital form. Each voxel, a three-dimensional pixel, holds information about mineral density, porosity, and growth. In a way, every scan is a biography written in calcium and collagen. Machine learning has only expanded what we can see. Algorithms trained on known skeletal datasets can now predict missing elements in fragmented remains, or reconstruct incomplete skulls based on statistical probabilities. What once took months of manual restoration now happens in hours. A missing jaw can be virtually inferred from the curvature of a cheekbone, a missing femur rebuilt from the geometry of a hip. These reconstructions aren't guesses. They're probabilistic models grounded in thousands of comparative scans. This same technology has begun to resurrect entire populations from fragmented bones. A set of partial remains excavated decades ago can now be digitally reassembled, revealing family groups, pathologies, or shared traits invisible to earlier analysis. CT data even allows for virtual histology, the ability to slice bone digitally at the microscopic level, revealing growth rings that mark childhood stress events, seasonal nutrition shifts, or disease flare-ups. Each skeleton becomes not an artifact, but a timeline. The precision of these tools also solves a long-standing ethical dilemma: preservation versus analysis. In the past, every study meant some degree of destruction, drilling for samples, cutting sections, cleaning surfaces. Today, scanning is non-destructive. A fragile skull can remain sealed in its protective case, while its digital twin reveals every secret within. This balance between curiosity and conservation marks one of the quiet triumphs of modern science. We can now study the past without taking it apart. Blind data protocols, one of the more subtle innovations in recent years, have changed not only how we see bones, but how we think about them. By anonymizing scans, researchers remove the metadata that might subconsciously bias interpretation. The algorithm doesn't care about site names, assumed sex, or cultural context. It sees geometry and density, nothing more. This impartiality doesn't erase context, it refines it. Once patterns are identified, human interpretation returns, now guided by cleaner evidence. For instance, when a dataset of hundreds of European Neolithic skeletons was analysed through blind morphometric clustering, the results redrew boundaries of population relationships. Specimens thought to represent different cultural groups turned out to share closer structural affinities than expected. The variation within a single community sometimes exceeded that between entire regions. What we once saw as cultural difference now looks more like environmental adaptation, the subtle fingerprints of climate, diet, and motion on the body. Another fascinating use of these methods comes from reconstructing posture and movement. Virtual skeletons can be animated in biomechanical simulations to estimate gait, strength, and flexibility. By modelling muscle attachments and joint angles, scientists can replay how ancient people walked, lifted, or threw. The precision is eerie. You can watch a digital skeleton pivot, its joints guided by physics engines derived from modern anatomy. It's not guesswork anymore, it's measurable motion. All of this has created a paradox. Archaeologists now spend less time in the field and more time in front of screens, yet they are seeing more than ever before. The digital bone record is richer, denser, and safer than the physical one. But it also demands new disciplines: data curation, algorithm training, and statistical literacy. Skills that old field notebooks never required. The archaeologist of the 21st century is part geologist, part data scientist, and part detective. The pace of progress shows no sign of slowing. Portable CT scanners are now used directly in excavation sites, capturing fragile finds before they even leave the ground. Drones equipped with hyperspectral sensors can identify bone material from soil composition. Software pipelines can process an entire burial's scan data overnight, flagging anomalies for human review by morning. The partnership between human expertise and computational analysis has made archaeology more precise and more honest than ever before. It's easy to romanticize excavation, to imagine discovery as the moment when sunlight first hits a buried artifact. But increasingly, discovery happens quietly. When pixels align, when a data point flickers out of place, when a model's geometry whispers that something doesn't fit. The thrill is no less real. It's just invisible. Some of these techniques, like 3D morphometrics, are already being integrated into education. Students now handle virtual replicas of Neanderthal skulls and early Homo pelvises on digital tablets, rotating and measuring them as if in a lab. No fragile bones at risk, no shipping delays, no lost context. The democratization of access means that anyone, anywhere, can now study humanity's deep past with a fidelity once reserved for the few. The irony, perhaps, is that this technology, so cold and mathematical on the surface, brings us closer to the people behind the bones. Every scan captures not only their structure, but the record of their lives, the healed fractures, the worn teeth, the calcium lines that speak of famine or migration. Without touching them, we see them more clearly than ever before, and that may be the real evolution here. Archaeology, once defined by touch and soil, has entered the age of light and code. The bones remain silent, but the data speaks, not in words, but in patterns, frequencies, and forms. It tells us what endurance looks like when reduced to geometry, what survival means when measured in pixels. We may never know their voices or their names, but through these scans we can still read the language written in their skeletons, without ever laying a hand on them. A dark cave, windless and still. The fire has long gone out, leaving only faint smoke stains on the walls. In the corner, under a shallow overhang of rock, lies a skeleton, carefully placed, knees drawn up, head resting on what was once a cushion of moss and hide. Around it are traces of ochre and flowers, now fossilized into dust. Whoever buried this individual did not do so in haste. They had taken time, the one resource early humans rarely had, to lay another person to rest. It's easy to think of prehistory as a time of brutality and survival, of tools and teeth and hunger. But scattered through the fossil record are quieter stories, ones written not in weapons or walls, but in the evidence of care. Across tens of thousands of years and multiple human species, archaeologists have begun to recognize something that might be our oldest and most defining invention: empathy. The first clues came not from the bones of the strong, but from the bones of those who should not have survived. At Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq, excavations revealed several Neanderthal skeletons dating back around 50,000 years. One of them, now famous as Shanidar I, had been severely injured in life, with a crushed skull, a withered arm, and a blind eye. His right side was crippled, and one leg showed signs of an old, poorly healed fracture. Yet, remarkably, the bone tissue had remodelled, a slow biological process that can only occur if the individual survives long enough to heal. Without the ability to hunt, defend himself, or gather food, he must have been cared for. That realization changed everything. For decades, Neanderthals had been portrayed as brutish, instinct-driven survivors, strong, but lacking compassion or foresight. Shanidar I, and others like him, told a different story, a social world capable of sustained empathy. Someone had brought him food. Someone had kept him warm. Someone had decided that his life still mattered. Later discoveries reinforced the pattern. In Spain, at a site called La Chapelle-aux-Saints, a Neanderthal skeleton of an elderly male was found buried in a deliberately dug pit. He suffered from advanced arthritis, tooth loss, and spinal degeneration that would have made mobility painful and eating solid food nearly impossible. Yet the evidence of healed bone growth suggested years of survival in this state. He must have depended on others for sustenance, a clear sign that prehistoric communities, long before modern Homo sapiens arrived in Europe, valued cooperation over mere survival. Homo sapiens show the same pattern, often on a larger social scale. At Kafze Cave in Israel, dating to around 100,000 years ago, researchers found the carefully buried remains of a young child with traces of ochre pigment, one of the earliest known symbolic burials. The use of pigment and deliberate positioning suggests not just disposal, but ritual attention. The people who buried this child were not behaving out of instinct. They were acting from meaning. Across Africa, Eurasia, and the Levant, similar signs appear. Deliberate body positioning, grave markers, the inclusion of shells or flowers, all silent expressions of empathy turned into behaviour. One of the most striking cases of care comes from the Dmanisi site in Georgia, over 1.5 million years old, long before modern humans, even before Neanderthals. Among the fossils of early Homo erectus lies the skull of an individual who had lost all but one tooth. The sockets had fully healed, meaning he had lived for years without the ability to chew. Someone must have helped him eat, possibly through pre-chewed food or soft plants. That act, simple as it seems, rewinds the timeline of compassion to an almost inconceivable depth. Empathy, then, might not be an invention of Homo sapiens at all, but a shared inheritance of the genus Homo. It's tempting to think of intelligence in terms of tools or language, but perhaps social intelligence, the ability to care, was the first true technology of survival. A society that protects its injured and elderly gains more than moral strength. It gains memory. Elders remember migration routes, tool-making secrets, the timing of seasonal shifts. Compassion isn't just emotion. It's a form of information storage. Modern science has found ways to trace this invisible history. The microscopic analysis of bone healing, for instance, allows researchers to calculate how long an injury took to recover, a timeline of care. Certain fractures, like those seen at Shanidar, require 6 months of consistent survival after trauma. Archaeologists can even detect infection responses in ancient DNA, revealing whether a wound healed or worsened. Each healed scar is a data point of cooperation. Even burial practice itself can be seen as the logical outcome of caregiving. To care for the dead is an extension of caring for the living, a refusal to let another body become food for scavengers, or a hazard to the group. The first burials in that sense were not religious acts but practical compassion, preserving dignity where none was required by instinct. Over time, that practicality turned symbolic, then spiritual. Our rituals began as care. In 2020, new excavations at Shanidar Cave uncovered yet another individual, Shanidar C, a Neanderthal adult carefully placed in a prepared hollow. Next to the bones were traces of pollen grains, perhaps from flowers deliberately laid with the body. Whether symbolic or simply aesthetic, the gesture remains profound. It shows thought, time, and tenderness. When you think of the limited lifespan, harsh climate, and constant danger that these people faced, the act of stopping, of doing something unnecessary for the sake of another, becomes almost miraculous. Recent studies comparing human and Neanderthal brains through endocast modelling suggest both species shared a high density of neural connectivity in the parietal and frontal lobes, regions linked to social cognition and empathy. In other words, the capacity for care was built into their anatomy. The archaeological record merely shows its expression. These moments of care aren't confined to adults. At Upper Paleolithic sites like Sunghir in Russia, burials of children include ornaments, beads, and ivory spears, items requiring hundreds of hours of work. Such effort, expended on those who could give nothing in return, speaks to an emotional depth that transcends survival logic. Love, or something very much like it, existed long before language to describe it. When paleoanthropologists map the emergence of cooperation, they find that caregiving likely influenced evolutionary success more than aggression did. A group capable of coordinated compassion could weather famine, illness, or injury better than one built on dominance. Each act of care strengthened the collective resilience. The genes that favoured empathy, patience, and social bonding quietly outlasted those that didn't. Evolution may not select for kindness directly, but it rewards stability, and stability requires connection. You can even see this pattern in how early shelters were arranged. At Middle Paleolithic sites, hearths and sleeping areas often show evidence of shared space, a social core around which the vulnerable could rest. Ash layers and bone fragments suggest that some individuals remained in the same area for extended recovery periods. In caves from France to Siberia, archaeological layers reveal repetitive patterns of occupation and return, perhaps the ancient equivalent of a home, not defined by walls but by proximity and care. In recent years, scientists have begun to talk about the archaeology of compassion, the study of emotional intelligence through material evidence. It's not sentimentality, it's statistics. The ratio of healed injuries to fatal ones, the frequency of deliberate burials, the presence of pigment or grave offerings, all can be measured, compared, and mapped across species and millennia. The pattern is clear. As brains grew, so did empathy. Cognitive expansion wasn't only about abstract thought, it was about the ability to understand another's suffering and act on it. And perhaps that's what makes empathy a technology. Like fire, it multiplies survival through sharing. It's not visible in the fossil record like stone or bone, but its effects are unmistakable. The elderly Neanderthal who lived with arthritis, the child buried with care, the wounded hunter who healed. Each is a fossil of feeling, proof that the survival of the kindest was as real as the survival of the fittest. In the end, What separates humans from the rest of life may not be intelligence or even self-awareness, but the willingness to pause and help another. Long before the first city or script, before agriculture or astronomy, our ancestors discovered something more fundamental, that one life sustained can sustain the many. The archaeological record calls it care. We might call it civilization in its earliest form. And as we trace this lineage of compassion through time, from Dmanisi to Shah Nigar to Kafse, the pattern seems unmistakable. Empathy wasn't a late bloom of culture, it was the root. Imagine this. A small group of humans huddled around a fire somewhere in Africa, 300,000 years ago. The flames crackle, and the air smells of roasted tubers and damp soil. They don't speak yet, not the way we understand speech, but the night is full of meaning. One nods, another gestures toward a sound in the brush, a third raises an eyebrow, and everyone falls silent. In that moment, without words, they agree. Cooperation didn't begin with grammar, it began with attention. For decades, anthropologists have asked a deceptively simple question. How could a species built for competition become so dependent on cooperation? The fossil record offers only hints, but modern cognitive science, primate studies, and hunter-gatherer ethnography paint a striking picture. Long before language, early humans likely developed systems of social balance that favoured equality, reciprocity, and emotional signalling. They had to, because survival depended less on the strongest individual and more on the group's ability to stay together without collapsing under its own egos. The archaeological evidence suggests that by about 300,000 years ago, early Homo sapiens and their close relatives lived in small, fluid groups, rarely exceeding 100 individuals. These communities were mobile, opportunistic, and interdependent. There were no palaces, no chieftains, no surplus to hoard. In such fragile systems, dominance was a liability. A bully might steal food once, but risk exile the next day, and exile meant death. Thus, the earliest social contracts were invisible, an unspoken agreement to share, to forgive small mistakes, to cooperate enough to survive another season. Modern hunter-gatherers such as the Hadza of Tanzania and the Juhwansi of southern Africa still preserve echoes of this dynamic. Anthropologists studying them in the 20th century noticed something peculiar. Their societies were remarkably egalitarian. Food was shared immediately after hunts. Leadership rotated depending on skill and circumstance. Ridicule and humour were often used to keep arrogance in check. This levelling mechanism, as researchers call it, may be one of the oldest psychological tools in our species, a form of social technology that predates speech. But how would this work before words? The answer might lie in the architecture of empathy itself. Cognitive anthropology proposes that before syntax, or even complex vocalization, humans relied on what's known as shared intentionality, the ability to coordinate attention and action with others toward a common goal. It's what allows two people to silently lift a heavy log together, or to look at each other and instantly understand that it's time to move camp. This skill requires not vocabulary, but awareness of another's mind, a neural bridge built from trust. Somewhere in the deep past, this bridge became the foundation of equality. When communication is built from glances and gestures rather than commands, hierarchy struggles to form. Everyone becomes both speaker and listener, actor and observer. It's the quiet democracy of survival. Archaeological traces of this cooperative intelligence appear indirectly. The uniformity of early stone tools across wide distances suggests the spread of shared knowledge, not the product of one genius, but of communities teaching one another. Hand-axe traditions lasting hundreds of thousands of years imply systems of imitation and standardization, which are nearly impossible without social learning and patience. The shape of those tools, symmetrical, balanced, optimized for grip and efficiency, might reflect the same mental symmetry that governed social life. Even the distribution of ancient campsites tells a story. In Pleistocene Africa and later Eurasia, Hearths and sleeping areas are often arranged in loose circles, not rows. There is no single central place of authority, no architectural sign of rank. Everyone faced the fire equally. In a literal sense, humanity grew up around circles. Primatology offers another lens. When researchers observe chimpanzees or bonobos, our closest relatives, they find that cooperative behaviour doesn't require speech at all. Bonobos share food, comfort the injured, and even coordinate hunts through eye contact and touch. What separates us from them, however, is scale. Early humans expanded cooperation beyond immediate kin, an evolutionary leap requiring memory, reputation, and moral expectation. These were maintained not by punishment, but by subtle reciprocity. The instinct that if I help you now, you will help me later. By the time early Homo sapiens spread across Africa, this web of mutual understanding had already become our species' primary defense mechanism. Cooperation made us stronger than any predator. But cooperation also required constant maintenance. Anthropologists suggest that rituals of laughter, play, and mimicry evolved to reinforce group cohesion, the ancestors of both conversation and humour. It wasn't that early humans couldn't fight, it's that they learned when not to. Mathematical models of early forager societies, built from modern ethnographic data, show that the most stable groups were those with balanced reciprocity and low inequality. When a single individual tried to dominate, the group fragmented. When everyone contributed, even modestly, collective success increased exponentially. In evolutionary terms, fairness was adaptive. Over millennia, our brains likely rewired themselves to reward fairness with positive emotion and to punish greed with guilt. Morality, in its first form, was probably just a side effect of cooperation. Before language, communication was performed by bodies, faces, and shared context. A hunter might signal with a flick of the wrist, a parent soothe with a hum. Rhythmic sound, clapping, footfalls, the repetition of work songs, may have synchronized group effort. These proto-musical patterns could precede speech by hundreds of millennia, training the brain to anticipate rhythm, predict sequence, and mirror emotion, all prerequisites for complex language later on. So, before grammar, there was groove. What's striking is how these pre-verbal systems naturally flatten hierarchy. In a song or rhythm, everyone participates equally. No one voice dominates for long. In such an environment, leadership becomes situational rather than permanent. The strongest hunter leads the hunt. The best tracker guides the route. The elder interprets the weather. Authority rotates, dissolving once its purpose ends. This flexible structure is one reason Homo sapiens, unlike most primates, could sustain large cooperative networks without violence spiralling out of control. The archaeological record also hints that this balance held for an astonishing length of time. For almost 300,000 years, humanity lived without kings, armies, or monuments. Only with the rise of agriculture and stored wealth, a mere 12,000 years ago, did hierarchy begin to crystallize. The long prehistoric majority of our existence was likely governed by a form of equality enforced not by rules, but by relationships. Evolutionary biologists like Christopher Boehm have argued that such social dynamics may have shaped our neurochemistry. Oxytocin and dopamine, the hormones associated with trust and bonding, probably reinforced behaviours that promoted group cohesion. In short, our brains rewarded kindness because kindness kept us alive. Over time, this biochemical reinforcement loop became cultural, passed through imitation and upbringing. Every child learned the unspoken rules of belonging: share, listen, and don't take more than your share. To modern ears, that sounds idealistic, but to prehistoric minds, it was pragmatic. Cooperation was simply efficient. You didn't need to believe in fairness, and it was built into the math of survival. And perhaps that's the quiet genius of those early societies. They functioned not because everyone was good, but because everyone was needed. A system where each person mattered equally, because each person's contribution meant food, shelter, or safety, becomes self-sustaining. When the environment is harsh, equality isn't a moral stance. It's an ecosystem strategy. As language finally emerged, slow, fragmented, accidental, it didn't create cooperation, it refined it. Words gave structure to what gestures and rhythm had already established. Syntax followed sympathy. Grammar followed trust. The linguistic brain didn't invent equality. It inherited it from a lineage of shared fires, balanced circles, and mutual care. When we speak today, when we share stories, or teach, or debate, we're not inventing communication. We're reenacting an ancient instinct to connect without hierarchy. The first equality wasn't political or philosophical. It was biological, whispered between gestures, anchored in shared survival. And when we eventually named it, when we finally had words for fairness, friendship, or love, we were only giving language to something that had always been there. The story of humanity may have started with tools and fire, but it endured because of something subtler, our ability to listen to one another before we could speak. Cooperation was our first language, and perhaps the only one we never truly forgot. A robot that can read our errors better than we can. Somewhere in a dimly lit lab, a cluster of processors hums softly. An artificial intelligence system trained not to predict the stock market, not to generate poetry, but to study the bones and pottery fragments of our own past. Archaeology, that oldest of human sciences, has entered the age of algorithms, and for the first time we're teaching machines how to correct the stories we once told too confidently. At the surface, the idea sounds almost ironic. Archaeology was always about human intuition, the trained eye that sees a pattern in the soil, the quiet moment when a field worker realizes two fragments belong together. But the 21st century has introduced something humbling, an ocean of data too vast for any one human mind. Tens of millions of digital scans, excavation notes, isotopic measurements, and artifact registries. All uploaded, all searchable, all hungry for interpretation. The challenge is no longer discovery, but discernment. What matters now is how to tell which patterns are real and which are ghosts of our own bias. This is where machine learning entered the dig. Around the early 20s, researchers began feeding neural networks with archaeological data sets, everything from pottery shards to burial inventories, not to automate fieldwork, but to find hidden relationships that our eyes might have missed. These programs began to group artifacts by form, colour and composition with no cultural assumptions. A human archaeologist might describe a particular blade as masculine or ritual, but the algorithm only sees edge curvature, flake scars and clustering vectors. It recognises similarity without narrative. In that way, the AI archaeologist is not creative, but it is strangely innocent. One early breakthrough came when researchers used deep learning models to detect anomalies in excavation records from the mid-20th century. When they asked the system to group burials based purely on object co-occurrence, ignoring any written gender tags, the results revealed a quiet embarrassment. Across multiple European sites, graves previously labelled as male, due to weaponry clustered statistically with others identified as female, when the artefacts were compared without human preconceptions. In other words, the patterns of material culture refused to obey our categories. The algorithm had no opinion, it simply saw the math. That neutrality has become its strength. By stripping away descriptive labels and focusing on quantifiable geometry, chemistry, and spatial relations, AI can expose where our interpretations have been skewed by language or tradition. For example, in lithic studies, the analysis of stone tools, neural networks trained on tens of thousands of images now outperform graduate students in identifying the cultural period of an artifact. But more importantly, they reveal inconsistencies in how we classify them. When two identical scrapers are assigned to different categories by different teams, the algorithm doesn't take sides. It simply highlights the inconsistency and waits for us to explain ourselves. The irony is hard to miss. We, who once feared that machines might inherit our biases, now ask them to help us find them. Archaeologists call this algorithmic introspection. The process involves designing a model that learns the statistical structure of known data, then scanning for outliers, the places where human interpretation deviates most sharply from mathematical expectation. It's not that the machine knows what's true, it simply identifies where we might have been too confident. It's the digital equivalent of a peer review that never sleeps. In a project at the University of Tübingen, a neural network was trained to analyse excavation maps from the 19th century, the earliest hand-drawn records of burial clusters. By converting them into coordinate data, researchers could compare ancient human judgment with modern spatial algorithms. The result was sobering. Up to 30% of reported family burials were statistically indistinguishable from random placement. What 19th century scholars saw as household units may simply have been the convenient alignment of stones in eroded soil. Our ancestors in science, it turns out, were seeing what they expected to see. But artificial intelligence is not limited to re-evaluating old paperwork. Field archaeologists now use machine vision drones capable of scanning entire landscapes for buried architecture, mapping subtle soil depressions invisible to human eyes. When the algorithm encounters something anomalous, a pattern of vegetation too regular to be natural, it flags it, quietly, without ego. One project in Jordan's Wadi Rum desert used AI-assisted satellite imagery to identify ancient caravan routes missed by decades of manual survey. The system learned to recognise the faint linear alignments of cairns and camp traces under sand, reconstructing trade networks once dismissed as myth. Even microscopic analysis has changed. In residue and microfossil identification, convolutional neural networks can now classify pollen grains, starch residues, and diatom shells with astonishing precision. This allows archaeologists to reconstruct past environments and diets faster than ever before. The model doesn't know that one species implies agriculture and another foraging, it just sees morphology. We, however, read that data and recognise the consequence. That agriculture may have started earlier or differently than we thought. Perhaps the most philosophically interesting development lies in blind protocols. These are experimental workflows where an AI system receives stripped-down data, no gender, no cultural labels, no chronological cues, and is asked to cluster findings solely by measurable similarity. Only after patterns emerge do researchers reintroduce the original metadata. The shock, often, is that the algorithm's clusters cross our social boundaries entirely. Grave goods once thought exclusive to one sex, one culture, or one social role appear distributed far more evenly when stripped of human narrative. The past, when filtered through math, looks strangely less divided. And yet, even this method raises questions. If a machine can reveal our cognitive biases, who corrects the machine's own? Every algorithm carries the fingerprint of its designer, the selection of input data, the threshold of similarity, the decision of what counts as an anomaly. Bias hasn't vanished, it's just been outsourced. The new generation of archaeologists is learning to read not only the past but the code that interprets it. The future of excavation may rely as much on debugging as on digging. There's also a poetic irony to it all. Archaeology began with brushes, shovels and intuition, a science born from hands in the dirt. Now it continues through lines of code, trained on patterns that no single human eye could ever perceive. Somewhere between those two extremes lies a lesson about humility. For centuries we assumed we could reconstruct the past through logic alone. The machines remind us that our logic was never neutral. They don't replace our judgment. They just hold up a mirror we can no longer ignore. Some of the most fascinating AI work today involves anomaly detection in artifact assemblages. Imagine a dataset of 50,000 burial sites, every bead, blade and bone digitized. The algorithm is instructed to find correlations that don't fit. It discovers, for instance, that across time and geography, certain ornaments appear consistently in graves of both adults and children, both with and without weapons. Where a human might read gender or hierarchy, the algorithm reads continuity. perhaps shared belief or trade. The story shifts from identity to connection. This shift has begun to redefine archaeology itself. Where it once sought certainty, it now seeks patterns of uncertainty. Machine learning excels at probability, not proclamation. It forces us to think statistically rather than narratively. Instead of saying this object belonged to a warrior, we begin to say, this object is found with items typical of hunting contexts in 60% of cases. The language of archaeology becomes humbler, less mythic, more mathematical. But in that humility we inch closer to truth. Artificial intelligence, paradoxically, returns archaeology to its philosophical roots. The earliest fieldworkers from the 19th century dreamed of objectivity, to let the past speak for itself. They failed, of course, because every human lens distorts. Now, in the 21st century, we build systems designed not to speak for the past, but to expose our distortions. Machines don't see meaning, they see distribution. They remind us that patterns exist even where intention does not. As we look ahead to the coming decades, AI's role in archaeology is set to expand beyond reclassification and into prediction. By modelling erosion, climate impact, and ancient trade routes, neural systems can estimate where undiscovered sites are most likely to be found. The digital descendants of old explorers, except their compass is probability. The idea of a predictive excavation might sound like science fiction, but it's already saving researchers years of work and protecting sites from accidental destruction. Still, perhaps the most important thing these machines uncover isn't buried in the ground. It's buried in us, in the quiet biases, the mental shortcuts, the comfortable myths that shaped our understanding of history. When an algorithm corrects a catalogue, it doesn't erase the human story. It clarifies it. It reminds us that truth isn't a static artifact. It's a process of continual refinement, a conversation between the data and our own fallibility. We may never create a perfectly objective archaeologist, whether human or artificial. But in trying, we become better scientists. Every correction a machine makes is really a reflection of how far we've come, from the age of handwritten guesses to the era of self-correcting knowledge. In the end, perhaps that is what progress looks like. Not the certainty of answers, but the courage to let even our tools disagree with us. The soil still holds its secrets. The algorithms hum quietly, learning from every fragment, and somewhere between carbon dates and code, the past waits, patient as ever, for us to finally see it clearly. A scientist kneeling in the dirt, but not to claim a discovery, to listen. Not to impose meaning, but to ask permission. That is the quiet transformation happening across archaeology today. After more than a century of excavation built on confidence, sometimes arrogance, modern field science has begun to rediscover its oldest forgotten skill, humility. The story of the last few decades is not just about better tools, sharper dating methods, or satellite precision. It's about the slow re-education of the scientist, the realization that knowledge isn't extracted from the earth like ore, but earned through respect, patience, and dialogue. In the early years of archaeology, the scientist was often imagined as an explorer hero, a figure of certainty, shovel in hand, claiming to uncover civilizations as if they were waiting for his approval to exist. Field reports were written in declarative tones. This site is a temple. This artifact belongs to a king. This burial represents a culture. The more complete the sentence, the more authoritative the scientist seemed. But by the 2010s, something had shifted. Excavation sites had become conversation spaces. Teams began to recognize that every trench sits not only above ancient layers, but also within living memory. Communities who still walk that same soil, who may have stories about the stones being moved. The new generation of field archaeologists learned that discovery isn't a solo act. It's a collective calibration between data, interpretation, and lived connection. For example, in Australia's Northern Territory, excavations in Arnhem Land are now conducted side by side with Aboriginal rangers and elders who interpret rock art and site orientation not as ruins but as ongoing presences. Their oral histories often describe landscape features that align with geological and archaeological findings: flood cycles, extinct animal sightings, migrations across land bridges. Science verifies, but also learns to listen. In North America, fieldwork at ancient mound sites has changed in similar ways. For much of the 20th century, indigenous perspectives were treated as folklore rather than evidence. Today, collaborations with native archaeologists and tribal historians bring context that carbon dating alone could never offer. What was once ritual architecture in old excavation logs sometimes turns out, under consultation, to be the foundations of dwellings or ceremonial centres still remembered in song. The ground becomes both archive and ancestor, and the archaeologist, instead of conqueror of secrets, becomes an invited translator of memory. This re-education of the scientist doesn't come from ideology, it comes from error correction. Decades of misinterpretation taught the field a painful truth. Knowledge built on partial understanding crumbles over time. The answer isn't guilt, it's calibration. Archaeologists began to study their own behaviour with the same scrutiny they once applied to artefacts. Who collects the samples? Who names the site? Who writes the final report? The reflexive method emerged, a practice of turning the analytical lens inward. Every field decision is now logged not just for data, but for reasoning. Why this trench? Why this layer? Why this interpretation? The method doesn't erase bias, but it exposes it. And technology, surprisingly, has deepened this humility rather than weakened it. Remote sensing tools like ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry allow researchers to map entire ancient settlements without disturbing a single stone. The less they dig, the more they learn. Excavation is no longer destruction in the name of progress, it's an act of restraint. In Egypt, new surveys around Saqqara have revealed hidden tomb corridors using muon tomography, cosmic particles, not spades, doing the work. In Guatemala, LiDAR scans through dense jungle revealed networks of Maya cities long invisible beneath vegetation. Yet even these discoveries are approached now with quiet caution. Every revelation is followed by the question, what do we not yet understand? The field has also become more aware of the archaeology of archaeology, the layers of interpretation left by past researchers. Old field notes are now studied as artifacts themselves, with biases annotated, terminology corrected, and assumptions challenged. One historian described the process as excavating the excavators. You dig not for gold or pottery, but for clarity, tracing how language, confidence, and career incentives shape the way we once read the earth. The role of mentorship has changed as well. The professor's tone has softened from proclamation to facilitation. In field schools from Greece to Kenya, students are now encouraged to debate interpretations, not memorize them. They learn to write excavation notes that begin not with conclusions but with conditional phrases. It may indicate, it could represent, the pattern suggests. It's a linguistic humility that reflects statistical realism. Archaeology, after all, is an inferential science. It deals in likelihood, not certainty. The closer it gets to truth, the less it claims ownership of it. Even the social dynamics of the dig have evolved. Field hierarchies that once mirrored military order, director, supervisor, labourer, have given way to collaborative structures. Local workers are no longer just hired hands. They're consultants who carry spatial memory of the terrain, subtle cues in the soil that no foreign researcher could detect. When a farmer points out that a patch of earth always cracks differently after rain, it often leads to the discovery of buried walls or hearths invisible to instruments. Science, in learning to listen, regained something it had nearly lost: intuition grounded in place. The change is not without resistance. Some worry that too much reflexivity turns archaeology into philosophy, that if we question every interpretation, we risk paralysis. But humility doesn't mean hesitation, it means precision. The more aware scientists become of their limits, the more reliable their conclusions. A fieldworker once said that archaeology now operates like astronomy. Both study things they can't fully touch, inferring order from fragments of light or stone. Certainty is replaced by confidence intervals. There's a quiet beauty in this new approach, a reminder that discovery is not domination, but relationship. The archaeologist of the 21st century no longer stands above the pit. They kneel beside it, aware that every layer they remove is a page in a book they can never fully read. The soil doesn't give up its secrets easily. It requires patience, context, and conversation. One of the most instructive modern examples comes from Northern Europe, where early Mesolithic settlements along ancient shorelines were reinterpreted through ethnographic dialogue with local fishing communities. What older archaeologists had catalogued as ritual bone deposits turned out, under local explanation, to be remnants of seasonal fish processing, the organised byproducts of a life lived with rhythm and respect for cycles. The insight didn't come from a new instrument, it came from listening. The same humility is now transforming museum curation. Artefacts once displayed as trophies are being recontextualised through new research collaborations with descendant communities. In many cases, those artefacts aren't removed. They're reinterpreted, with updated descriptions that acknowledge alternative readings of their meaning and use. The act of labelling becomes an act of balance. Science speaks, but it no longer speaks alone. Some critics dismiss this shift as unnecessary politeness, but in truth, it's scientific pragmatism. Collaboration produces more data, more accuracy, and fewer blind spots. Involving diverse perspectives isn't moral posturing, it's error reduction. The best archaeologists today understand that even the soil carries multiple dialects, and the more you listen, the clearer the story becomes. Perhaps that's what the re-education of the scientist is really about. It's less a revolution than a quiet remembering, a return to the patient curiosity that drove the first humans to pick up a fossil and wonder what it meant. Every excavation, every data set, every artifact reminds us that we are temporary custodians of knowledge, not its owners. The goal isn't to master the past, but to understand how little mastery ever truly existed. If the 19th century gave us the archaeologist as explorer, and the 20th gave us the archaeologist as analyst, then the 21st is shaping the archaeologist as listener, a figure who can kneel in the dirt beside a local elder, a satellite feed and a neural network, and see all three as partners in the same conversation. Science at its best is not the triumph of certainty, but the art of humility practiced well. The soil still whispers, the sensors hum, and the scientist finally is learning to listen again. A story so old, so often repeated, that even after it's been disproven, it still walks quietly through our language like a fossilised ghost. You find it not in the soil, but in school books, in museum displays, in the way we casually describe the past as though we were there. These are the myths that never truly die. They just harden, layer by layer, into the sediment of culture. And archaeology, perhaps more than any other science, knows what it feels like to dig through them. It begins innocently enough. A discovery is made, an interpretation proposed, and a generation of textbooks builds upon it. Illustrations are drawn, timelines simplified, and the messy uncertainties of research are edited into narrative. Then decades pass. The evidence shifts, technology advances, and the data no longer fits the old story. Yet the story persists. Teachers still teach it. Museums still repeat it. Tour guides still gesture toward reconstructed huts and say, "This is how they lived." Not because anyone is lying, but because the story has become a fossil, a beautiful, brittle echo of a time when we thought we understood. Science has a word for this phenomenon: cognitive entrenchment. Once an explanation settles into public imagination, dislodging it becomes harder than disproving it. Even when researchers publish corrections, the myth lingers, often stronger than before, because familiarity feels like truth. Psychologists call this the illusion of explanatory depth. the comforting sense that we understand something simply because we've heard it so often. It's why the idea of cavemen dragging women by the hair lasted long after anyone in anthropology believed it, and why old dioramas still portray early humans as brutish, squinting primitives, even though every bone tells us otherwise. One could say that scientific myths fossilize the same way bones do, through pressure and time. A story, like an organism, dies when it's proven wrong, but if buried deep enough in repetition, it preserves its shape long after its substance has decayed. The danger isn't in having been wrong, that's inevitable. The danger is in mistaking the fossil for the living thing. We stop asking new questions because we already have answers carved in stone. The persistence of false narratives isn't just about ignorance, it's about how human memory works. Neuroscientists studying the process of belief revision have found that when we encounter information that contradicts what we already know, our brains don't simply overwrite the old data, they compete. The old pattern resists deletion. To unlearn is harder than to learn, because memory prefers coherence over accuracy. That's why misinformation spreads faster than correction. The correction feels unfamiliar, and unfamiliarity feels risky. In archaeology, this means that every time we correct a misunderstanding, we aren't just rewriting a paragraph. We're rewriting an entire mental landscape. Consider how long it took to abandon the idea of a linear march of progress from ape to human, a neat procession that never existed in the fossil record but still exists in the collective imagination. It's easy to remember a ladder. It's harder to remember a tangled, overlapping tree. The ladder is simple, symmetrical and flattering. The tree is complex, unpredictable and humbling. So the ladder lives on, in murals, in documentaries, in casual metaphors about primitive versus advanced. Even professionals aren't immune. The most subtle fossils of myth survive in terminology, words that carry old meanings like sediment caught between letters. We still say prehistoric as if history began only when writing did. We still say discovered, as if the ancient world were waiting in silence for us to find it. These linguistic fossils shape the way we think about knowledge itself. They remind us that language, too, is a kind of archaeology, every phrase built atop the remains of older ones. Museums provide the most visible examples of this fossilization process. Many were founded during the height of imperial exploration, when archaeology was framed as a form of conquest, unearthing, collecting, classifying. Their halls became theatres of certainty. Each exhibit, carefully lit, gave the illusion that the past was static, solved and owned. Over time, even when the curators changed the signage or updated the context, the architecture itself carried a ghost of that confidence. The marble steps, the glass cases, the word exhibit, all remnants of an older way of knowing, fossilized in design. Cognitive bias research tells us that stories survive best when they flatter the storyteller. That's why myths of human dominance, genius, or inevitability endure. We prefer histories where our species triumphs, where evolution culminates in us. It takes effort to internalize that evolution has no destination, that it's a process, not a plot. It takes humility to accept that the past doesn't build toward us, but simply continues through us. And humility rarely makes for a good museum caption. But myths don't only fossilize in institutions, they fossilize in emotion. The first story we learn about the past often becomes part of who we are. It's comforting to think we descend from hunters and inventors rather than from ordinary survivors who cooperated, adapted, and sometimes failed. Myths about heroism satisfy a psychological need for order and identity. They reduce the vast chaos of prehistory into a story small enough to hold. That's not ignorance. It's a survival strategy of meaning. This is why, even in the 21st century, scientific correction spread so slowly. The facts may change overnight, but the human attachment to familiar narratives can last generations. A study from the early 2010s showed that even when participants were directly informed that a historical claim was false, many still cited it as true weeks later, not because they doubted the correction, but because the original claim had felt right. The brain, it seems, keeps fossils of belief in its own strata. So what can archaeology do about its own myths? The answer, paradoxically, is to keep digging, not just in the ground, but in the archives, in the museums, and in our collective metaphors. When a researcher today re-examines a mislabeled artifact or reanalyzes an old excavation report, they're not just clarifying data, they're exhuming the buried assumptions of the people who came before them. Each correction becomes a kind of intellectual excavation, unearthing not bones, but biases. And perhaps that's the real work of science, not to replace old myths with new ones, but to remember that every truth we hold today will someday be replaced too. We can only hope that when it happens, the next generation treats our own certainties with the same patience we now show to those before us. Because even humility, when written too confidently, becomes dogma. It's worth asking how many of our current models, our charts, timelines, and cultural categories will one day look as quaint as the sketches of cavemen in fur coats that once filled textbooks. Probably most of them. That's not failure. That's the rhythm of knowledge. Each generation builds, simplifies, forgets, and corrects. Each one leaves a thin fossil layer of interpretation that the next will gently brush away. There's something strangely beautiful about that. Myths fossilize because they were once loved. They made sense to the people who told them. They were scaffolding for curiosity, not cages for it. The danger comes only when we stop updating them, when we mistake the story for the structure. The cure, as always, is curiosity. The same quiet, patient curiosity that once led us to dig in the first place. If there's a lesson in all this, it's not that myths are the enemy of science, but their shadow. They reveal where understanding once stood. Each fossilized idea is evidence of what we once believed possible. And just like fossils in rock, they remind us of something vital, that knowledge, like life, leaves traces. Some of them beautiful, some of them wrong, all of them human. The dust has settled. The last brushstroke has cleared the soil from the ridge of an ancient skull, and there it is again, that unmistakable silence that follows discovery. It is not a silence of mystery, but of reflection. The bones, as they always have, say nothing. They never argued with our theories, never confirmed our pride, never whispered our myths back to us. They simply existed, patient, unchanging, immune to interpretation. The only lie, if there was one, was how we looked at them. Every generation of science inherits bones, and every generation believes for a while that it finally understands what they mean. But bones do not tell stories. We do. They are records of chemistry and pressure, not morality. Calcium does not know hierarchy. Fossils do not remember gender or status or destiny. They carry only shape and weight, the residue of life translated into matter. Everything else, every assumption, theory and conclusion, belongs to us. And so the history of archaeology is not just the history of what we found, but of what we projected onto those remains. Over the centuries, those projections have faded one by one. The noble hunter, the submissive gatherer, the savage, the genius, the chosen, the forgotten, all replaced again and again by data that refused to agree with our imagination. Yet through each correction, something remarkable persisted. The bones themselves never changed. They waited for us to learn how to see. In their stillness, they held a lesson about science that words rarely capture. That truth is not something we invent, but something we slowly uncover once our noise quiets down. When we look at a fossil today, whether it lies in a glass case or beneath a microscope, we aren't just looking at anatomy, we're looking at endurance. Every ridge, every groove, every healed fracture is a record not just of survival in life, but of survival in meaning. Long after empires, languages, and theories crumble, the bones remain. And when our instruments improve, when our biases fade, when our questions evolve, they will still be there, waiting to be asked again. That is perhaps the quiet miracle of science. Not that it is perfect, but that it forgives. It forgives our arrogance, our mistakes, our certainties. It keeps giving us another chance to see clearly. Archaeology, genetics, climatology, they're all forms of listening, and the more carefully we listen, the more the universe seems to repeat one phrase: "You were close. Try again." The bones do not punish misunderstanding, they simply wait for precision. In a sense, the bones are not evidence of the past, but evidence of our changing minds. Every corrected assumption is a kind of fossil layer in itself, a sediment of humility. The earliest scientists saw myth in the bones. Later, they saw hierarchy, then symbolism, then adaptation, then connection. Each generation removed one more layer of itself from the fossil record. What remains is closer to truth, not because the bones changed, but because we finally began to vanish from between them. Today, when an archaeologist bends over a dig site, what they really kneel before is time, not power, not discovery, but duration. The earth itself has been the patient observer all along. It keeps what we lose and loses what we keep. It erases our errors slowly, grain by grain, until only what mattered physically remains. And in that residue we find the fragments of creatures who are neither gods nor beasts, just humans, trying, as we are, to make sense of their smallness. That's the quiet revelation hidden in every skeleton. It reminds us that intelligence is not measured by what we know, but by how often we are willing to correct what we thought we knew. To study bones is to study humility materialized. Each vertebra, each worn tooth, each healed break tells us that life was fragile, and yet it persisted, that mistakes were made, and yet survival continued. Evolution itself is a system built entirely on correction. Every mutation that fails is a forgotten hypothesis. Every one that works is an experiment that endured. We are made of trial and error. If you step into any great museum and stand before a reconstructed skeleton, a mammoth, a hominin, even a trilobite, you'll notice something subtle. The plaque beneath it lists discovery dates, revisions, comparative studies. It's not a monument, it's a timeline of correction. Those small italicized names, the scientists who once guessed wrong, the ones who guessed better, they're all part of the same human conversation. It's not failure, it's continuity. Science does not advance by triumph, but by revision. And yet there is something poetic about the way our oldest remains keep teaching us what it means to be new. We once thought bones were relics of death. Now we know they are records of adaptation, snapshots of life's persistence through change. We once imagined they carried messages. Now we realize the message is their silence. They never lied. We just kept asking the wrong questions. In that sense, every bone, every fossil, every remnant of a life once lived is a kind of mirror. It reflects not who we were, but who we are becoming, how we learn, how we err, how we refine. The mirror in the dust is not literal. It's a metaphor for consciousness itself. To study the past is to study the brain's own archaeology, the excavation of bias, belief, and understanding layer by layer. It's humbling to remember that even now we are leaving fossils of our own thinking behind. The digital records, the preserved data, the countless archives of today's science. All of it will one day be examined by descendants who will see where we went wrong, where we overreached, where we refused to let go of beautiful familiar myths. They'll see us, the same way we see those before us, as a species earnestly trying to make sense of an incomprehensible world. And maybe, if we've done our job well, they'll find that we left a little less distortion, a little more accuracy, a cleaner mirror. Because that, in the end, is all the bones ever asked of us. To look without projection, to describe without invention, to learn without pride. They were never symbols, never messages, never warnings, only evidence that life existed, endured, and transformed. Everything else, the meaning, the lessons, the poetry, comes from us. And if there's beauty in that, it's because it proves that science and imagination were never enemies, only reflections of the same human curiosity that began the first time someone bent down, picked up a bone, and wondered. There is no final truth in archaeology, only clearer approximations. The bones will outlast us, as they outlasted every theory before us. One day, long after we're gone, new minds will study what we left behind, the artifacts, the satellites, the digital fossils of our curiosity, and they'll correct us too. And that will not be an insult. It will be the continuation of the same dialogue we've been having with the Earth since the first stone tool struck a spark. So when you think of bones, don't think of death. Think of patience. Think of the quiet endurance of matter, waiting for perception to catch up. Think of how many mistakes it takes to arrive at one fragment of truth. Think of how extraordinary it is that we can even notice the difference. In the end, the bones never lied. They never needed to. They simply were, and that was always enough. Thank you, fellow Sapiens, for wandering this timeline with me, for drifting into deep time, for slowing down and remembering. If this helped you fall asleep, helped you study, or simply helped you step out of the noise for a while, thank you for being here. If you think more people should know this story, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, share it with the Sapiens in your life, and tell me, are you listening before bed, while working, or somewhere in the world I can only imagine? And as always, stay curious, stay calm. I'll see you in the next story.